listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway. Only on Sputnik Radio.
10 days that shook the world. All that is sacred is profaned. From Mother's Day through Mass, all the way to a failure to bury people in a dignified manner with their families beside them. All that is solid melts into air. Economies crash. A recession, probably a depression, has begun all across the world, but particularly in Europe and in North America. It is incredible how swiftly, in the 7 days since I last addressed you, how now we have reached a stage where so many millions, maybe hundreds of millions of our fellow human beings are living in fear of their very lives. We'll be naming the guilty men this evening and also singling out for praise those who deserve it. We'll be talking about the political impact, the economic impact of the existential threat that is COVID-19. We'll be asking, where's Biden? Has he fallen ill? Has his mental health actually collapsed? He has disappeared. The fellow who hasn't disappeared sounds increasingly berserk at the White House podium. And as for Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings, or Dominic Cullings, as I'm going to call him, you'll hear that they are amongst the guilty men. Fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy ride.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language.
The mother of all talk shows. The only education you can get for free. George Galloway.
This is Radio Sputnik.
Broadcasting to you, of course, all over the world, thanks to the wonders of the internet and SputnikNews.com. If you are in the Washington, D.C. area, you can listen to us on FM 105.5 are the magic numbers there. On AM across America, from coast to coast, you can listen to us. But of course, this is a radio show with pictures. And many of you, perhaps most of you, well over 500,000 of you last week watched us as well as listened. Many on Facebook. And if you are among those watching on Facebook, either on my own Facebook page or on RT's multiple Facebook platforms, please share right now with all of your friends, all of your followers, all of your contacts. You can also watch on YouTube, my own YouTube channel, or on RT's YouTube channels. You can even watch on Twitter. And however you're watching, however you're listening, we need you to draw this show to other people's attentions, because this is the place where the guilty men will be named and shamed. And I have a long list, a list as long as your arm, and going back far more than the beginning of this year. We'll also be signaling out those who are worthy of praise and, in some case, beatification. The reality is that everything in the whole world has changed, and forever, in these 10 days, 20 days, 30 days, 60 days that have shaken the entire world. I was indistinct about the starting point, and that is one of the issues I'm going to discuss in my monologue this evening. But the world has changed in many ways. First of all, scales have fallen from our eyes and truths emerged like icebergs in declining levels of water. We see the 7/8 of the reality of our world that has been hidden, at least to many people, maybe most people, over most of their lives. It has changed the economy. The economy has been effectively nationalized, at least here in Britain, but also in the United States, where Donald Trump is sending checks, imagine, of thousands of dollars. Imagine. Not to the people he normally sends money to, the 1%, the rich and already powerful, but to ordinary people. And the reason is the intervention by the state in the economy in the midst of this catastrophe is not because old orthodoxies have been abandoned, not because they are no longer believed. You can put it in a crude equation. The government-state intervention in the economy as a result of this health catastrophe is in direct proportion to the fear of those who have hitherto governed our affairs, that the people, having learned what they are now learning and will learn in the next couple of months, may demand, may take from the rich and powerful that which should never have been theirs in the first place, but which they hoped we would allow them to continue to hold. I'll explain what I mean by that in some detail in the course of this monologue. But the world will never be the same again politically. We are revealed to be lions led by donkeys. And that donkey in the United States is not just the one at the podium in the White House. That donkey is also the Democratic Party, which has successfully strangled to death the only candidate that could successfully have run and beaten Donald J. Trump in November. Bernie Sanders is no more. The saintly Tulsi Gabbard has endorsed Joe Biden. Joe Biden has gone missing because it's not safe to allow him out alone. He'll pick a fight with voters. He'll curse them and swear at them. He'll ask them outside for a fight, even though he's the best part of 80 years old. He'll lose his way. He'll forget his own name. He'll forget the name of the president that he served as vice president, Biden-Bama. He will go off script, or rather reveal a true script that is potentially, completely, utterly ruinous for any possibility that the Democratic Party can seize the White House in November. That means we're almost certain now, short of him getting coronavirus and becoming horse to combat, we're almost certain to have at the podium for the next 4.5 years a man who told us that the coronavirus was a Democratic Party hoax. A man who told us that it was like a mild flu. A man who told us that America would get through this easily. A man who is an apologist for the political and economic system which has now placed literally millions of American citizens at risk of death and serious permanent ill health because they don't even have the basics. They have a third world health service for scores of millions of Americans. Of course, America has great doctors. It has wonderful health facilities. But for scores of millions, 60, 80, 100 million Americans, they're scared to go to the doctor and ask to be tested because if they are tested, they will simply not be able to afford the treatment which will then become ineluctable, inescapable, absolutely necessary. Donald Trump has wavered, havered. He has skewed everywhere at the podium and in the halls of power of the White House. And people don't expect much more from him. But I'm bound to tell you, there are other guilty men of whom it was possible, indeed likely, that people had reposed more confidence in. Let me start with the guilty man called the European Union. The European Union visited Italy not a month ago, not 3 weeks ago, not in a medical suit, not bearing hazmat, not bearing face masks, not bearing medicines, not bearing ventilators or test kits. The European Union visited Italy to give them a fine of 70 million euros. Fine them for daring to subsidize their own tourist industry in Sardinia. Meanwhile, Cuba and Russia are rushing to the aid of Italy, a European Union member, a NATO member. A non-socialist country is now receiving an influx of health workers from socialist Cuba, whom we're supposed to hate, whom the West has quarantined this past half-century or more. Russia, which may well be on the brink of a major coronavirus crisis, itself is sending its doctors and its medicine to Italy. Where is the European Union? Where are the fraternal governments of Italy? They are absent without trace, except where they are trying actively to make Italy's problems even worse. My heart breaks for the Italian people, for those who have lost people and are not even able to say goodbye to them, where there can now in Lombardy be no more burials, where cremation is mandatory, and where even the crematoria are now so full they're having to turn coffins away, where doctors and nurses are dying at their post in the front line trying to save the lives of their patients, where mass cannot be held, where priests are struggling manfully to deliver the last rites to dying patients through plastic walls. This catastrophe is, of course, as yet of unknown source. Donald Trump calls it the China virus. Well, that's as accurate as calling the flu pandemic of 1918 the Spanish flu, though it had nothing whatsoever to do with Spain. This virus may or may not, I'm personally not persuaded, I've got to tell you, have arisen by entirely natural causes, first in China. But if you think that it's present all over the world because China is to blame, then you are blinded by ideological hatred and rage. As a matter of fact, China is the only country to have beaten this virus, and within 12 days was able to identify the exact nature of this virus and immediately give it free everywhere all over the world. China, with its decisive action, because of the kind of state, the kind of country that it is the only success story so far, followed by South Korea, a non-communist country, an Asian country, but which has admirably, swiftly, and in the most serious way tackled this outbreak. In so doing, they gave countries like America, countries like Britain, weeks of grace in which they ought to have, could have, should have armed themselves against the unseen menace that was about to sweep their lands and cut down their people. But we wasted that time, and we now know, thanks to the Sunday Times, why we in Britain wasted it. We wasted it because Dominic Cummings, the Prime Minister's right hand, was secretly and then not so secretly following the politics of Malthus. His prescription was to allow the oldest, the weakest, the illest amongst us to die. Hundreds of thousands of us at best, and millions of us at worst. Now, what can you say in 2019 about a government whose policy was to allow millions of their own citizens to die? In a weird parenthesis, many of whom had voted for Boris Johnson just 3 months before putting him into power. Old people in Britain, by a huge majority, voted for Boris Johnson, yet Boris Johnson was ready to see them die. There are guilty men all over the place. They'll be emerging in the course of this show. We'll be naming them. But there's something more profound, more historic, that has now to be said. We thought, or most of us did, that we were living in an era of social medicine. We thought we were living in a welfare state. We thought we had authorities competent to deal with national existential emergencies. But none of that was true. And this did not begin with Boris Johnson, or Theresa May, or David Cameron, or even Gordon Brown and Tony Blair, even John Major. This began in 1979. 40 years ago, we began systematically to destroy the sinews, the vital organs of the society which in the post-war period we built in this country. We pretended that we still had a national health service, even when it became well less than national, and became not a health service, but a sickness service, where public health provision was effectively abandoned, where private medicine was effectively encouraged to grow and flourish, so that we are now, in this emergency, imagine, paying £2.5 million a day to the private health service in Britain, who have kindly made for £2.5 million a day available their beds, their ventilators, their staff, who are all paid better, equipped better, are cleaner than ours. The health service that we thought was the national health service. The privatization of our health system, which has been going on for 40 years uninterrupted, has left us too with a health service unable to cope even with this early stage of this existential threat to our people. This is early. We're 2 weeks behind Italy. When we are Italy, then the one critical emergency that has been declared by one hospital in London, in Harrow, will be the norm throughout all of our hospitals. None of them are capable of facing up to what we are about to face. We don't have enough critical care beds. We don't have enough ventilators. We don't even have face masks. I've got a face mask. Doctors and nurses in Britain now are dealing with coronavirus patients without a face mask, or at least a clean one. They're having to reuse things on which it says clearly, do not reuse. Our doctors and our nurses are at the front line fighting this at the risk of their own lives, because we have a government in the 6th richest country on the earth that hasn't even ordered enough face masks, even now, to protect even our own staff, never mind the general public. I have this because my wife brought it back from Korea months ago, just in case we'd ever need it. What kind of state are we in that the minimal planning strategy for national emergencies have not been taken, and where we face the cutting down of potentially millions of our people? You think I'm exaggerating? Well, the rate of increase in deaths in Britain, I'm not so fixated on the numbers who've got it, because frankly, without testing, you can't possibly know how many people have got it. You're only testing people that present at the hospital. There could be millions of us got it already. But the number of deaths in Britain is now increasing more sharply than Italy, than China, at a comparable stage of the development of the pandemic. And as Italy is being overwhelmed, so very well might we. And we have a government that for some bizarre reason announces on a Friday morning that the pubs will close on Saturday, begging millions of people to go out boozing on the Friday night, fraternizing closely in crammed public houses. God knows how many people have caught the virus on the last night of boozing in pubs in Britain. We have a government that keeps saying, stay away from each other, or we'll have to come forward with new measures that will somehow force you to. Again, an open invitation to still more people to pack the Columbia Road Flower Market or Richmond Park, as they did this weekend, because they know, inevitably, as the death toll rises, that such measures will become inevitable, as they have become inevitable in Italy, in Spain, in France, and as they were from day one in China. That's how China beat this thing, by taking draconian action. And amongst the guilty men, I accuse you libertarians, as you obviously like to call yourselves, those who went along with Trump. It's all a hoax. It's all some device to seize our civil liberties. What about the civil liberty of staying alive, of your children staying alive, of your old mother staying alive? People who spend all day on Twitter calling the doctors liars, scientists liars, virologists liars, epidemiologists, they're all liars. The Chinese government, liars. Russian government, liars. They're guilty too, and utterly reckless of the health and indeed the lives of their fellow citizens. But I've gone over my time. Here's my last point, although I'll return to it, be sure. It's abundantly clear that capitalism is part of the sickness. Do the maths. You see, if you can't stay home for economic reasons, as is the case in many countries, and is the case even now for millions of people in Britain who are self-employed, like me, I've got to come to work. So do people much less well paid than me who are self-employed. If you can't get the best health care that's available, unless you can afford to pay for it, If you can't build public services and real communities unless you can pay for it, then you and your system are part of the problem. That's why I say, when this is over, there will be a reckoning. And that reckoning will include the guilty men and women, yes. But it must also include this inescapable fact that there is such thing as society, and this virus proves it. No man is an island entire unto himself, as John Donne told us centuries ago, that we either stand together or fall separately, that we cannot combat existential threats to our human existence based on a free market capitalism, which simply isn't up to such a task. It's not fit for purpose. There's a poll. A, have Western governments' responses to the crisis been A, too draconian, B, not tough enough, C, about right? You can vote now on my Twitter feed at George Galloway. Let's take a break.
Radio Sputnik.
Tune in every Wednesday to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker and John Kiriakou for a regular segment called Beyond Nuclear, where Brian and John discuss nuclear issues, including weapons, energy, waste, and the future of nuclear technology in the United States, with Kevin Camps, the radioactive waste watchdog at the organization Beyond Nuclear. Listen on Wednesdays right here on Radio Sputnik.
Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Of course, time waits for no man, and the US presidential election will go ahead. Can you imagine if Donald Trump cancelled it because of the emergency? My goodness, that would set the pussy hats running. But on the assumption that democracy will take its place, take its time in November, it's going to be Donald Trump versus Joe Biden if Joe Biden is still standing in November. That's a legitimate question because nobody has seen him. And in the outtakes of when we last saw him, it was enough to chill your blood. This man should not be out alone. He should be under 14-day quarantine as a man at risk because of underlying problems. You might think that unkind, but you won't think that if he becomes the president. The Ukrainian candidate, if he were to become the president, would be like Ronald Reagan in his dotage and then some. So what is going on in the Democratic Party? What is going on with Joe Biden? I'm joined by a very considerable expert, the assistant editor of the wonderful Grey Zone Project, journalist, writer, filmmaker, Ben Norton, who joins me now. Ben, welcome back on the show.
So happy to be here. Thanks for having me, George.
Let's start with Joe Biden, because most of the people watching and listening to this will have been hoping that the Democrats would pick somebody that could actually defeat Donald Trump in November. But they haven't, have they?
No, not at all. And the irony is that the DNC, this is the apparatus that controls the Democratic Party, the Democratic National Committee, the DNC has said for years now that Joe Biden is the most electable candidate. Of course, the majority of polls show that's not true. Bernie Sanders is much more popular. Bernie Sanders is, in fact, the most popular U.S. politician. What the DNC really means is that Joe Biden is the most pro-mainstream centrist party politics. He's not going to rock the boat. In fact, Joe Biden, at this point, with his mental state, he's really just a kind of blank slate. I mean, you were saying, George, that people haven't seen Joe Biden in days. And this is a guy who, we need to be very clear here, suffers from very bad dementia. He has very bad mental health problems. And one of the reasons the DNC loves him as a candidate so much is because they know that he's just really going to follow orders, that he'll be a kind of figurehead, and that the party apparatus, the intelligence agencies, large corporations in Wall Street, they're going to be the ones who actually govern. And meanwhile, that's only if Joe Biden can win the election. And like you said, the chances of him actually defeating Donald Trump, I think, are very low, because all you have to do is see Trump on stage and Biden on stage, and Biden would get completely demolished. He can barely speak rational thoughts, yet alone defend himself against someone like Trump, who, you know, Trump is an awful person in many ways, but you have to admit that Trump is a very effective debater, and he can demolish his political rivals with ease.
I don't know, I think you're probably too young to have seen Mike Tyson in his pomp.
Not too young. I've seen his fights.
Mike Tyson could tear his opponents limb from limb, especially in the first 5-6 rounds. He was literally unstoppable. That seems to me what Donald Trump will be like up against Joe Biden.
No, I think you're absolutely right. Joe Biden, maybe 10, 20 years ago, you know, you could say that maybe he was a fighter. Now, he always had right-wing politics. He was always pro-war. He was always pro-Wall Street. But you could say maybe 10 or 20 years ago that he could fight back. But at this point, he doesn't even remember where he is. He just gave a speech a few days ago, and it was clear that he didn't remember what he was doing. He lost his train of thought right in the middle of his sentence. And also, this is a guy who just several weeks ago gave a speech in which he said, as someone running for the U.S. Senate, I'm going to do this. He forgot he's even running for president. So how are we supposed to expect this man who, again, we just have to acknowledge this fact, is suffering from extreme dementia? How are we going to expect him to fight in the political arena someone, a Tyson figure like Trump, who, regardless of what you think about Trump's politics, he's a very able politician when it comes to challenging his opponents, ridiculing his opponents. And you need a fighter who's going to push back, someone like Bernie. People say that they don't like Bernie because he's not nice. Well, since when are politicians supposed to be nice? Look at Donald Trump. If you want to defeat Trump, you need someone who's on the left and has an actual political program that working class people want, and also someone who's willing to fight for it. And Biden is neither of those two things. He's right-wing and can't fight.
All of which begs the question, it's a difficult one, Ben, for you and for me and for others who think like us. How was it possible for Bernie Sanders to lose to such a guy?
Well, Bernie's not out yet, but you're right that he's definitely on the ropes. It looks like he's probably, I don't think he's going to withdraw soon, but he's probably going to lose, and Biden will likely be the candidate. Now, there are a few reasons. One, we should be blatantly clear that the DNC has rigged this process. This is clear to anyone who looks at the process. There has been massive voter disenfranchisement. The DNC just held primaries last week in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic, endangering public health, even though the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, the U.S. government's health arm, they said that the DNC should not hold the primary elections, and it still did. So that was clearly an egregious, ridiculous act. Also, if you look at the exit polls on primary after primary, consistently, the primaries where Bernie was supposed to win, but he lost by a small margin, consistently the exit poll shows a 10, 12, even 15% difference from the actual results when we have results. And the DNC, in some cases, doesn't release the results until a week or two after, as we saw with California. And the results themselves are rather dubious because they're computerized and there's not a paper ballot trail. So we can't double check what the results are. So there are so many irregularities. And then finally, we have to acknowledge that aside from the extreme media bias, the constant media attacks, the rigging by the DNC, it's also true that Bernie, he never took off his gloves. You know, talking about the boxing metaphor, Bernie, like Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, he was always afraid of damaging the party. Corbyn didn't want to damage the Labour Party. Bernie didn't want to damage the Democratic Party, even at the moment when these party apparatuses were viciously attacking and smearing both Corbyn and Bernie. And the thing is, Bernie didn't want to be blamed. Bernie thought that if he didn't win the primary, he didn't want to be blamed for someone like Biden losing to Trump because Bernie attacked Biden aggressively in the primary process. So instead, Bernie took a step back and never really attacked Biden and his other rivals. So what that meant is that they would constantly attack him, and then he would just take the blows, just like Corbyn would constantly be attacked by the Blairites, and he would never respond. And the reality is, you can't do that if you're trying to run an aggressive, progressive campaign against the ruling class, against the party elite, because in order to do that successfully, you have to be a strong leader. And unfortunately, both Corbyn and Bernie, I think, were not nearly strong enough.
There is a race issue, though, also, isn't there? Joe Biden, for some reason unclear to me, having lied about his non-role in the civil rights movement, his lie about Mandela, having given the eulogy at Thurman's funeral, one of the great last segregationists in American politics, actually having very dodgy views on race, nonetheless got a very clear plurality of black people's votes, which in the Democratic Party primaries is, of course, extremely important. In the state of Missouri, black people over 60 voted for Joe Biden by 96%, Bernie Sanders 3%, according to the exit poll. How do you account for that, and how can that be avoided in the future?
Well, it's a good question. First of all, we should realize that on the racial lines in terms of differences for voting, if you look at young people, those differences disappear. So Bernie Sanders has a majority of young black voters, and regardless of age, Bernie Sanders had a majority of Latino, a plurality, I would say, of Latino voters. So it's not just black voters, specifically it's older black voters who went with Biden. And I think there are a few reasons for that. One, because these are people who are not really, older people in general are, there are so many great exceptions, but in general, older people are not as engaged on social media, not online, and they get most of their news from the large TV corporate conglomerates, CNN and MSNBC. And CNN, especially MSNBC, but also CNN, had insane, nonstop anti-Sanders propaganda every single day, day in and day out. And also, the thing about Joe Biden is, like you said, even though this is a guy who hobnobbed with segregationists, who has said many extremely racist things, he does have a political history in a way that Bernie Sanders does not. Bernie Sanders is from the Northeast in Vermont, which is a small state and a mostly white state. So I think the congruence, most importantly, of the media and the fact that the old forms of media, the TV and newspapers, have been viciously anti-Sanders. In general, that meant that older folks, and including older black voters, have overwhelmingly gone with more party establishment candidates like Biden, whereas younger voters who are engaged in social media and alternative media and who want something new, they want a change from the status quo, they largely went with Bernie Sanders.
Now, we're ignoring the elephant in the room, of course. It might be that all of this is small beer come November because your country and mine, but I have a feeling, a bad feeling, that in yours it's going to be the worst in the whole world. This coronavirus crisis is going to become, well, indescribable, unimaginable even. What's the feeling abroad in the United States about this? Are people seized of just how serious this is? Are they seized of the fact that it may be the worst thing that ever happened to the United States? And I include 2 world wars in that.
Well, I don't know about the worst thing, because we can't forget the genocide of indigenous peoples and enslavement of Africans. But definitely in the past 100 years, I think you're right. Compared to, not that many Americans died in World War I and World War II compared to Europe. So I think you're right that we could be talking about thousands, hundreds of thousands, Even potentially, we'll see, but some medical experts are saying that if it's not contained, if serious measures like quarantine and social distancing are not enforced by the state soon, we could potentially be seeing millions of deaths because there's 330 million people in the US. Even if you take 1% of that, that's 3.3 million people. And that's considering a very low death rate. So,
well, it's currently 10% in Italy.
Absolutely. 11% Italy. I mean, it's out of control. So I think you're right that this could be a total catastrophe. And the thing is, a lot of Americans haven't really realized that. There's a weird contradiction. A lot of people in the US are very paranoid in general, and it's a very fearful country. Everyone's always afraid of each other. So, of course, people have seen on the news that Americans, for some reason, have bought months' worth of toilet paper and have been stocking up on all this food. But at the same time, many other Americans don't think it's a big deal. They think it's exaggerated. And they've been going out with friends, going to the park. So I think that part of that is cultural, but part of that is because the US is a very decentralized country. And after decades of neoliberal policy, the national government, even though abroad, the federal government, the national government is constantly waging war, imposing sanctions, abroad its actions are very authoritarian. Inside the country, the federal government is much weaker than people realize, and it's largely based on different state governments. So each state has its own response. New York State and California State have responded pretty aggressively, taking the measures that medical experts say they should take. But many other states have not responded. So I think, and of course the federal government under Trump has done very little, and until recently wasn't taking it seriously at all. So unfortunately, I think that people aren't going to realize how much of a catastrophe this will be until they start seeing deaths. And we've already seen some deaths, and the number of cases is now skyrocketing exponentially. So people really need to get serious as soon as possible, because this could be a total catastrophe.
Ben Norton, sobering words. Thank you for your perspective on both the political and the health crisis in the United States. Now, I did a short for RT on this very subject. I wasn't wearing one of these masks, but something much more heavy duty. Take a look. Never mind the herd immunity. What about the herd mentality, particularly in Britain's mainstream media? When Boris Johnson completely disappeared from view, the mainstream commentators inferred that he was working really hard behind the Downing Street drapes. And when he emerged to announce a policy so berserk, nobody else in the entire world endorsed it, they told us, well, that was science. Now they say the science has changed. But what has really changed is that thanks to real academics, we now know that the policy that was being followed by Boris Johnson and the British government put at risk the lives of hundreds of thousands of British people. The idea that if we all got the coronavirus, COVID-19, that somehow we'd miraculously develop a resistance to it, made absurd by the fact that the virus is able to mutate. Suddenly, the science has changed, the BBC told us. It's not the science that changed, it's the relentless criticism by the World Health Organization and virtually everyone else in the world that's forced the government to change. This was Boris Johnson's first big test, and he has failed it. It's time now in Britain for a government of national unity. Boris Johnson must reach out to Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the Labour Party, and the leaders of the smaller parties, and bring them in to the governance of this existential threat to British society as we know it. People are bulk buying and hoarding, so poor people, elderly people, and mothers with small children cannot even get their hands on the bare essentials. Nothing has been done to force the supermarkets to impose rations on their customers so that everyone can get their fair share of what is required. Public places, theatres, cinemas, clubs, pubs are not being closed, but people are being told not to go to them, meaning that when they go out of business, there's no possibility of a claim on their insurance policies because, hey, they voluntarily closed down their own businesses. We are looking at the possibility of hundreds of thousands of bankruptcies in small and medium-sized businesses in Britain. What about the big businesses? What about the bearded Mephistopheles, Sir Richard Branson, who lives on an island that he owns in the British Virgin Islands, where he lives precisely for the purpose of avoiding British taxation, coming forward with a begging bowl for £7.4 billion of taxpayers' money to bail out his business. The government cannot be relied upon to save the small and medium-sized enterprises in favor of the ultra-rich and ultra-powerful. The government can certainly not be relied upon to defend the interests of the working people of Britain, many of whom are going home to an empty pay packet at the end of the week, at the end of the month. They're being promised that the 5-week delay on universal credit will be reduced to zero, and if you believe that, I've got a bridge here in London that I can sell you. But in any case, universal credit is pitifully inadequate for people to live and bring up their families on. The political class has failed us. The media echo chamber of the political class has failed us. There's more sense on Twitter than there is in the press conferences of the high and mighty, asking softball questions of the powerful. It's time to change tack. It's time for a government of national unity in a national emergency. Bring back Jeremy Hunt. Never thought I'd say that. Bring in Jeremy Corbyn. Bring in an administration of all the talents in whom the people can have confidence. That's the only way to beat this dreadful threat to everything British.
Have something to say? Do you disagree with George? Then call us now and give us your view.
Now, the poll is running fast, 1,300 votes so far. Have Western government's response to the crisis been A, too draconian, 11%, B, not tough enough, 70%, C, about right, 19%. You can vote on my Twitter feed. And on the email, I think this is from Steve Thomas. I know you're not a request show, but would you give a mention to my wife and the hard-working ITU nurses at Northwick Park Hospital about to complete a grueling 12-hour shift looking after COVID-19 patients? Thanks. Well, it's me that needs to extend the thanks, Steve, to each and every one of the health service workers at the front, not just in our own country, but in all countries. I did say I'd be mentioning guilty men throughout. Here's one. And I say to Boris Johnson in the most diplomatic terms I can, you have to get a grip of profiteering. You have to get a grip of panic buying, which is effectively legalized looting. You have to get a grip of hoarding. When I see shops charging £19 for hand gel, when I see shops, and I've seen them and I've circulated them on social media, charging £10 for paracetamol, I've got to tell you those shops are asking for serious trouble. And not just after this is all over, when they will surely be remembered, but right now, because I'll tell you something. If I needed paracetamol for my children and I didn't have £10 to give you for it, I'd just take it. And that takes us down a dangerous road. Social peace and order are vital in wartime. And looting and hoarding and profiteering are crimes in wartime. And it's about time you got your ass in motion on this subject, Prime Minister. Tony says Russia has sent 9 IL-76 cargo planes full of decontamination vehicles to Italy at the request of the Prime Minister. China, Venezuela and Cuba are also on the ground assisting. But where are NATO or the EU? You couldn't make that up, actually. George, please convey my Mothering Sunday greetings to all moms and their moms, especially the moms in your family. If you're having Dr. Brar on later, please ask him on our behalf about the nearly 14,500 mortalities so far globally. 1, how infectious are the bodies? 2, unless prohibited on religious grounds, won't cremation have to be mandatory? And what processes will apply to the remains of the COVID-19 victims? I've not heard any other expert asked about this, not heard any other journalist bring it up. Why not the mother of all talk shows on Mothering Sunday? Yes, indeed. Salute to all the mothers and their mothers on this most extraordinary Mothering Sunday. Let's take a call from Scott in Glasgow. Go ahead, Scott.
Hello, George. Always a pleasure to speak to you. And the last time I spoke to you, I believe, was in person after the Musical Bride show. Excellent,
okay, welcome, mate. Welcome. Go ahead.
Thank you. As you know, I always respect your point of view from many years of hearing you speak. What I'm concerned about here, George, is your immediate, I'm not going to say capitulation because that's a bit strong, but your immediate sort of everything the World Health Organization says correct. I mean, this is a billionaire funded the Rockefeller Foundation, shaped funded this organization. I mean, a massive sway now is held over them by the Gates Foundation. I think it's a little dangerous to have billionaires in charge of World Health advice. Now, I'm suspicious of billionaires, and if billionaires hold a lot of sway over an organisation, which they unquestionably do on the World Health Organisation, then I question the World Health Organisation. And I know that you said earlier previously in some tweets, if anyone wants to question the World Health Organisation, just unfollow me.
I've got your point, Scott,
yes.
And I'm going to deal with it. Because of pressure this evening, we need to cut calls short, especially when I quickly grasp where you're coming from. First of all, the World Health Organization has nothing to do with billionaires. The World Health Organization is 170 plus countries in the world's health arms. Secondly, it's perfectly democratic. You don't get 2 votes because you're America or 2 votes because you're China. Everybody's got 1 vote on the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization is doctors. And I don't know about you, I trust doctors. I don't mean that every doctor is a saint. We know that that's not true. But who else am I to trust? Am I to trust somebody on Twitter? Am I to trust some libertarian who is cheery about giving away the civil liberty to congregate in Richmond Park on a Sunday in the middle of a pandemic? To hell with that kind of civil liberty. That's where I stand. You and I come from a different political perspective in that. Bill Gates did not make the decisions about how we should treat the COVID-19. It was made by doctors and medical experts. But more than that, never mind the World Health Organization. I'm in touch all day and every day with doctors here in Britain. With doctors, some of them in tears in Britain, at the front line, looking in the faces of dying patients, having to turn away the families of people who are dying. I trust them. I have no choice but to trust them. This is an emergency. And unfollow me if you will not accept that. If you don't accept that this is a world health emergency, I'm not the guy for you. Let's hear from Matt in Portugal. Go ahead, Matt.
Hello, George. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. Welcome. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to talk about like respiratory techniques for dealing with this crisis in the world scene, because there you have, like, you're talking about, I heard you speaking on the show earlier on about buying new respirators for the hospitals and stuff like that.
No. Look, we're desperately short of ventilators. So much so,
ventilators.
The British government asked JCB, who presumably were going to put a digger on the front to dig the graves afterwards. JCB,
right,
they begged them, please make us some ventilators. Why don't we have enough ventilators, Matt? Why does Germany have? Germany has 6 times more ventilators than us. Why?
Yeah, I heard that, but like, I don't know if you know, like in the Vietnam War, there was like this respiratory technique that was developed that's called umpa-lumping, right? In English, it's called umpa-lumping, but like, it's basically breathing in through your nose and out through your mouth, right? So in like a radioactive zone, then this will prolong your lifespan for like maybe sort of 7 days or something like that, yeah?
Yeah, okay, Matt. Thanks very much, mate. Hi, George. Russia, China, Venezuela and Cuba are rushing to assist Italy, while the EU and NATO are nowhere to be seen. Clive says the British government have been far too slow to implement the measures needed to protect the public from COVID-19. And Al Hernandez says the poll question kind of assumes it's a matter of brute force and not the quality of the response. Well, there's a limit to what you can do in a Twitter poll. Tyler Desix says the supermarket should fill the empty shelves with coffins so people can panic buy those as well. And Will Carpenter says, in regards to your poll about Western government's response, I think that it's too early to tell. Well, I've read your stuff, Will. I'm not impressed by it. To say it's too early to tell begs this question. Are we better overreacting to this threat or underreacting to it? I've got an 83-year-old mother that says, let's overreact to it. Why don't we? Jack Reed says the Chinese were responsible for the swine flu. What? Bird flu and now coronavirus because of the cruel conditions they keep animals in, and they eat exotic animals and bats. Yeah, unlike the pigs and cows and lambs and fish and pigeons and partridges that we eat. And of course, we deal with these animals in an absolutely uncruel way. There's nothing cruel about our slaughterhouses, nothing cruel at all about how we treat our animals. Swine flu did not come from China. SARS did not come from China. MERS did not come from China. But wherever it came, the Spanish flu came from Texas. Swine flu and the flu that broke out at the end of the First World War was probably caused by us taking pigs to the front line from England. But none of that matters. Viruses are everywhere. They could arise anywhere. If China had never told you about the virus that hit them in December, you would have been calling this the Italian flu or the Italian virus in January. Can't you see where I am? GFDO says Western governments haven't been tough enough. And Imran Khan says Western governments treated the crisis like weaker nations. And David C. says astonishingly feeble response from Western governments. A lack of early, strong measures would have led to many, a lack of will lead to many avoidable deaths and draconian curfews lasting months. And Nassim says, with all due respect to your good self, I think the wrong scale is being used here. We should look at what Japan South Korea and Taiwan have done, rather than China, which seems to be the example. The latter countries were less draconian, but more effective. I'll ask Dr. Ranjeet if that's true. And Mark H. says, yes, Boris should be ignoring the medical and scientific advice. He actually is ignoring the medical and scientific advice. And Fred says, I think Boris Johnson was right to suggest that we secure the vulnerable and leave the virus to roam free. But that, of course, is the opposite of what Boris Johnson suggested. It's the opposite of what the Sunday Times reveals today to have been the policy of the government as recently as February. It was herd immunity. Nothing about shielding the vulnerable, just herd immunity. Let it rip throughout the country, and though there will be many casualties, they will be old, or as Dominic Cummings put it, some pensioners will need to die. Some pensioners will need to die. What an epitaph for Dominic Cummings. But, you know, I never believed in the good Tsar, bad advisors kind of thing. I never blamed it on Rasputin. I blame it on the Tsar. Don't you? Let's go to the news. With whom? I'm no wiser, but it's the news right now.
Curious about our curriculum? Have something to say? Then call us now to join the debate on the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
Tune in every Tuesday to Loud and Clear for a regular segment called False Prophets, a weekly look at Wall Street and corporate capitalism, where we talk about the big economic issues of the week from the point of view of working people, the poor, and the U.S. position in the global economy. Join us this Tuesday and every Tuesday with financial policy analyst Daniel Sankey right here on Radio Sputnik.
It's time to double down with Max and Stacy.
Yeah, double down. We're talking markets, finance, business, economics, ka-ching, bling, just about everything money related on Sputnik. It's called Double Down.
We're asking, are dead cats bouncing or have fundamentals changed? That's this week on Double Down.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Radio Sputnik News.
The number of diagnosed cases of coronavirus has passed 300,000, with more than 13,000 deaths around the world. In the Italian region of Lombardy, the epicenter of the Italian outbreak, controls have been tightened as the country confirmed more than 53,500 cases of COVID-19. The number of people in Italy to have died from the disease is approaching 5,000. Just days after it overtook China as the nation to register most deaths from the highly contagious respiratory illness. Officials say a further 739 patients have died in a single day, taking the total number to 4,825. Sports and other physical activities outside have been banned, even if a person is exercising alone, and using vending machines is also forbidden. The increase of 19.6% was by far the biggest daily rise since the outbreak emerged in the country a month ago. A team of 65 Cuban doctors and nurses with experience in battling Ebola was due to arrive in the hard-hit Lombardy town of Cremina today, ready to help. Spain has registered 394 deaths from coronavirus in a single day. The United Kingdom could be put on lockdown if Britons continue to ignore advice aimed at slowing the spread of coronavirus. Housing Secretary Robert Jenrick is warning that asking people to stay at home in an attempt to suppress the number of cases was not a game, as he refused to rule out tougher action. 11 more people have died after testing positive in Britain, taking the total as of Sunday to 244. The British government has closed cafes, pubs, bars, restaurants and gyms for the foreseeable future as the spread of the virus continues to accelerate. But the UK has not yet followed the example of France, which is now requiring citizens to carry official paperwork in order to leave their homes. And New York City is 10 days away from seeing widespread shortages of supplies. That's according to the city's mayor. One of the world's busiest urban rail systems will be shut down for ordinary commuters from tomorrow morning to prevent the spread of coronavirus infection in Mumbai, one of India's most populous cities. Only government workers in essential services will be allowed to travel on the truncated service. 8 million people use Mumbai's crowded suburban rail network every day. And while California residents are being told to stay at home to prevent the spread of the disease, and all non-essential businesses and areas are being closed down, officials in Los Angeles are making sure that marijuana is still available to the public. Marijuana dispensaries are still being deemed as essential businesses and allowed to remain open. The decision to postpone this summer's Tokyo Olympics and Paralympic Games in Japan needs to be made now, according to the British Olympic champion Callum Skinner. The cyclist who fronts competitor-led movement Global Athletes says both should be rescheduled until the COVID-19 global pandemic is under control. He warned boycotts could ensue with the health of athletes at risk. In an interview, he said people think Olympians are superheroes, but they're just normal people and fall ill like everyone else. In other news, American country music legend Kenny Rogers has died aged 81. He passed away peacefully at home from natural causes. Rogers topped pop and country charts during the 1970s and 80s and won 3 Grammy Awards in a career spanning more than 6 decades. Dolly Parton, who duetted with Rogers on the hit Islands in the Stream, tweeted, "You never know how much you love someone until they've gone. I've had so many wonderful years and wonderful times with my friend Kenny, but above all, the music and the success, I've loved him as a wonderful man and a true friend." And finally, the world is doomed with only a few years left, according to a British academic. Jem Bendel, a professor in sustainable leadership at the University of Cumbria, is the author of an academic article, Deep Adaptation, a Map of Navigating Climate Tragedy, which has become the closest thing to a manifesto for a generation of self-described climate doomers. In it, he argues that it's too late for us to avoid the inevitability of a societal collapse caused by climate change. Instead, we're facing a near-term breakdown of civilization. Near-term meaning within a decade. The paper was rejected for publication by a peer-reviewed journal, whose reviewers said its language was not appropriate for an academic article. Bendel self-published the 34-page article online instead. It soon went viral. It's now been downloaded more than 500,000 times. However, his doom-laden predictions have been dismissed by prominent climate scientists. And that's Sputnik News.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway. Only on Sputnik Radio.
I don't know who that was reading the news, but he had a wonderful voice, had a kind of 1960s English idiom to it. It was like a Pathé News that you used to get on the cinema. Dr. Veronica Fowler on our Facebook says, there is a small team of us volunteering at Basingstoke, a North Hampshire hospital, COVID-19 lab, Stephen Kidd's laboratory. Today it was me, Dr. Veronica Fowler, and Dr. Sarah Fauch. These two are in the photo above. I am on the left. Dr. Fauch and I are volunteering on Mother's Day to keep the COVID-19 lab going at Basingstoke and North Hampshire Hospital. Molecular virologists, microbiologists are all coming together to fight this pandemic. How wonderful, how utterly wonderful. I take my hat off to you both and to all of those working at the front line. Now, of course, this is not just a health emergency. To call it an emergency is a grotesque understatement. This is an existential threat to the health and even the life of millions of people. But it's also, of course, by extension, an economic emergency. You could say disaster. I said earlier, we're already in recession. It seems to me impossible that it will not be a depression, but I don't know the economy as well as Jonathan Davies, who's an economist, a wealth advisor, and presenter of the podcast Booms and Busts show. And he joins me now, I'm glad to say. Jonathan, thank you very much for giving up your Sunday evening, entirely free of charge, to advise us. I'm sure you get a decent pay for advising others. It's particularly good of you to do it for the mother of all talk shows. Sum up for us, would you, the impact so far of the virus on the British economy and the costs of the British government's response, and where this is all likely to go, even if we ever go over this?
Well, we certainly will get over it. That is absolutely without question. You're in fact correct that we are unfortunately in recession. There is no question also that this quarter, which of course ends next week, and next quarter, the second quarter of the year, will see a very deep fall in the size of our economy, the GDP. It could be as huge as 10%, because clearly we're in lockdown practically. Discretionary spending is basically finished. All that people are spending on is groceries, more or less. In terms of how long this will last, well, that actually depends less on financial markets and governments, because the governments and central banks are throwing the kitchen sink at the problem. So financially, I think we'll come out the other side sooner than the economy. The economy will be in recession until we get rid of COVID-19, which might be in 6 months' time. I think more likely it's next year, although they have, certainly in America, they've started with drugs, which apparently they're having some success with. So we'll see how that goes. But the amount of stimulus globally that the central banks and governments are putting into it, in the UK, the Chancellor, £300 billion. We're a 1.5 trillion pound economy. They're putting in 20% of the economy to, quote, combat COVID-19. It's unprecedented. And then the central banks, so far, it's $5 to $6 trillion, euros, pounds, whatever. Literally astronomical. Again, unprecedented. It took them months through 2008 to get to those levels of stimulus. They've done it in less than a month. That's how serious they're taking this. We'll get through the other side, but the world will be very different, I'm afraid to say, in a year's time.
Yes, I'm sure about that. Let's ask the obvious question. Where did all this government money come from? When Labour stood in the general election in December on an almost infinitely more modest programme of public expenditure as this, it was denounced as unaffordable communism. Where did the Tories get this kind of money?
Well, may I say, first of all, that this is communism. The Johnsons just announced that they're going to take a stake in British Airways. If a nation owning state company or companies or industries is not communism, I don't know what is. So of course it's communism. And paying private sector employees 80% of their salaries, up to £30,000 a year. Of course, that's communism. Well, where they get the money from is they print it. They push some buttons on a computer at the Bank of England, and suddenly money appears. That's where they get all the money from. And in the future, it'll be the ordinary citizens, the middle class, the workers, largely, who will pay for it all, and will pay for it all over the next generation or two, because all this money printing in the UK and globally is, well, inevitably going to end the era, 40 or 50 years of falling inflation, and usher in 20, 40, 60 years of rising inflation. So we are the ones who are going to pay for it.
Are you certain there will be inflation? There hasn't been any with the quantitative easing so far. I appreciate this is a major step change, but is it inevitable? Because some evidence points to the contrary.
Well, nothing in economics or in markets is inevitable. But what's going to happen, George, in a year or two's time, we're going to start talking about the world pre-COVID-19 and post-COVID-19.
It's BC. It's a new BC.
And post-COVID-19, there's going to be some changes globally. We're going to de-globalize. We're going to bring back manufacturing from China. That in itself is going to be inflationary because, of course, China has acted as a deflationary force for 20 or 30 years. So one, deglobalization will be inflationary. Secondly, when you suddenly print money for no economic productivity whatsoever, clearly what you're doing is creating something out of nothing. And it'll go into people's pockets, but they're not actually producing anything in the economy. Therefore, that will be inflationary. And then what we're seeing, particularly technical but highly relevant in the markets, is that this month, the US dollar, the global reserve currency that in effect most, practically all global trade is affected in the US dollar, it shot up out of a multi-year range above a level it couldn't get for years. It's done so. In other words, the world is saying, give us dollars. We need dollars. They're buying dollars left, right, and center. Why? Because that is the safe haven. What's going to happen, however, as a result of that in the future, and the dollar is going to continue soaring for quite a long time, months, few years perhaps, and it will go through the stratosphere. What that means for the rest of the world is that stuff that they buy will be more expensive if it's all traded in the dollar. Put it all together, and you have a perfect storm, for a better word, for rising inflation. And with all these deficits, with all these borrowings that practically every country is doing, well, that's going to have to be serviced by more borrowing. The lenders will say, we will lend you, government, but we'll want higher interest rates because you become less stable. We can't guarantee we're going to get our money, so you're going to have to pay us a higher interest rate as compensation. Put it all together. It seems very likely to me, yes, we're heading to higher inflation. Not this month, super deflation right now, but on the other side of this, the end of this year and beyond.
Fascinating stuff. It's slightly counterintuitive for me and many, I think. Why the dollar? Because the United States is politically a trifle unstable. It has a half-impeached president who's widely derided around the world. Its economics, its fundamentals are not good. It's been losing its place in the international pecking order. It is politically and economically weaker than it was, yet its currency is stronger than it was. At the same time, gold, which used to be and still is in the cliche, the safe harbor that people go to in uncertain times, price of gold has been falling. Explain, if you would, Jonathan.
I understand your point of view that Trump is hated around the world. I entirely disagree with it. I think he's highly respected around the world. They may
We must live
not...
in different worlds, Jonathan.
Yeah, well, the simple fact is he's taking on a lot of the baddies in the world, and a lot of people really appreciate that. Secondly, inside of the US, until this month, admittedly, his polling rates were higher than Barack Obama's, when Barack Obama had 99% of the media on his side, whereas Trump's got 99% of the media against him. America is not as strong as it was, but then you have to ask yourself, when are you comparing it to? But what is special about America is it believes in the individual, it believes in free enterprise, the American possibilities. That is what's different about America. You should never bet against America. The Constitution is probably the greatest document after Magna Carta and the Bill of the Bill of Rights from the 17th century.
Yeah.
The greatest document ever written, or one of the 2 or 3 greatest documents. In terms of why the dollar, I would actually say to you, I'm a markets participant, and I often say, I could give you a baker's dozen reasons why the dollar, but ultimately it doesn't matter. Just look at the chart. The dollar is soaring. Thus, whatever the reasons you should say it shouldn't happen, it's happening. The world is desperate for dollars. You're quite right to ask about gold. And actually, as strange as this may sound, gold has actually been a safe haven. Why am I saying that? Because stocks have just had the fastest crash in history. They're down more than 30%. That's the international stocks. 40-50% the middle cap stocks, as in the national stocks, as opposed to the international stocks. They're down over 40%. The fastest crash in history. Gold is down 11%. Nothing goes in a straight line. In terms of in valuing gold against the US dollar, it's down 11%. It's up from $1,150 an ounce just about 2 years ago. It went up to 1,700. It's back to 1,500. Now, actually, I think it's going down to about 1,350 after such a massive rise from 1,150 over a year and a half, 2 years to 17, to go back to 1,350, particularly when you've got everyone selling their stocks and therefore they need liquidity, so they have to sell the things that have actually got some value. That's why gold's going down, not because people don't like it. On the contrary, the bullion dealers are running out. It's because some long-term holders have to sell because they need liquidity. But in the long term, like you should not ever, ever bet against America, you should not be betting against gold. It depends what your investing horizon is. But in the long term, yes, gold is going to be your insurance policy and store your wealth.
Lastly, Jonathan, I'm really grateful for your time and expertise. You and I are both Scottish. You'll know that the Scottish nationalist perspective on independence at the referendum in 2014 was predicated upon an oil price of well in excess of $100 a barrel. At this rate, the oil companies will be giving the oil away, maybe even paying you to take it to save their costs on storage. Is the oil price done for good? And is the Scottish independence separatist project dead with it?
Can I answer the second question first, because it'll be a quick one? I would say that post-COVID, just like the nonsense Extinction Rebellion fascists who want to take over the world, I think that whole thing is over and done with for a long time. It's not something that people are going to be interested in. Isn't it interesting that during March we haven't heard anything about the environment? In terms of oil, well, 2 weeks ago, in fact, on a Sunday night, here we are Sunday evening, a Sunday night, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia decided to take Russia on and increase their market share in oil, and just slashed the price of the oil in global markets $10 overnight. Oil had already been falling actually for quite some time, but that just was the kicker. It's interesting that the narrative is that the Saudis are taking on Russia. That may or may not be the case, but what I would suggest to you is that they're both taking on America. They're trying to get rid of the American oil complex, which has been pumping oil like Billio. That has actually kept oil from rising as much as it perhaps could have done in the last couple of years. There's no question American oil production will fall sharply. But again, don't bet on America, and certainly don't bet on American energy. I think the second point to say about oil is that one very positive effect of what we've done bringing down oil is, it seems to me, finally, the fascist communist Maduro in Venezuela will get his comeuppance. And finally, the Venezuelan people can be free. And then Venezuela, with the largest oil reserves in the world, and yet the poorest people in South America, the people with free market enterprise will finally, if that's how they reset it in Venezuela, will finally be able to prosper and stop dying from starvation. Long term, as I say, we're going to have inflation. And oil production will fall sharply. Oil will come back. We certainly haven't seen the end of oil. It's a nonsense idea. I can't remember exactly. You might even know, but something like 70 or 80% of our energy, maybe it's not as much as that, 60 or 70% of our global energy is still oil. There is no way on earth that even within a decade or a generation, you could get rid of oil from that position. Even with a move to, for example, electric vehicles, which appears to be here within 10 or 15 years, they're still going to need oil to produce energy, although what I hope that the governments around the world will do is invest in more and more and more nuclear, because that's the safest, cleanest, and as far as I'm concerned, the best source of energy that there is. And actually, no, I think oil is not bottoming here at the 20s in the relatively short term. I think we'll go into the teens. It will still be painful, but I wouldn't at all be surprised if in a few years' time oil is $100 as it happens.
Well, I knew we lived in different worlds, literally and metaphorically, and I'm grateful to have had a glimpse into yours. Jonathan Davis, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the mother of all talk shows. Phew, I'll need to take a break after that.
Radio Sputnik.
Tune in every Tuesday to Loud and Clear for a regular segment called False Prophets, a weekly look at Wall Street and corporate capitalism, where we talk about the big economic issues of the week, from the point of view of working people, the poor, and the U.S. position in the global economy. Join us this Tuesday and every Tuesday with financial policy analyst Daniel Sankey right here on Radio Sputnik.
Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com. We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. Radio Sputnik, we speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
George Galloway and the mother of all talk shows. Join us at the College of Knowledge, where there are no tuition fees.
Okay, we're still running this poll. Have Western government's response to the crisis been A, too draconian, 10%, down 1, B, not tough enough, 72%, up 2, and C, about right, 18%, down 1. You can vote on my Twitter feed. Best part of 2,000 of you have already. You've got about half an hour to get your vote in on that. Lots of calls. I want lots of calls tonight. We'll give more time to calls than we normally do. Let's hear from Sarkar in Glasgow. Go ahead, Sarkar.
Good evening, George. Nice to speak to you again, mate. In fact, for the last 2 months I could not call, but I was watching all your shows the next day because I was doing different shifts.
Okay.
But George, fantastic analysis.
Thank you so much.
George, my question is with relations to the primaries going on between Biden and Sanders.
Yes.
Okay. Believe me, as I personally believe, I'm a novice compared to your analysis, this is going a bit like the Labour elections under Corbyn in 2019 compared to possibly Bernie Sanders, the way he could have led the Democrats against Trump in 2020. It seems just like Labour thought they would rather lose with Corbyn as their leader to a Tory, I think the Democrats believe they would rather lose to Trump than win with Bernie Sanders. Correct me if I'm wrong, George.
No,
I'd like to hear you.
It's pretty hard to contradict that, to be honest. They must know that Biden isn't up to this. It did amaze me that they didn't have a better candidate. It did amaze me that they didn't plump for someone else, but put their chips on Joe Biden. They must have hoped that he could somehow pilot to November, and his shortcomings would not be as obvious as they have become very rapidly indeed. I mean, I'm in no doubt at all why he's disappeared, because I saw the outtakes of his last appearance. I saw him losing his thread, talking into a phone, but I later saw him give a highly scripted, short commentary, but the camera kept rolling, and it was pitiful. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Once the camera went off, he was literally rudderless. He was looking around. He couldn't speak right. His wife came on. It was very, very embarrassing for him. And of course, the Trump camp are already circulating that widely. That's where I saw it, from James Woods, the right-wing Trumpian actor. He put it out. And they've got tons of this stuff, and it'll be ruthlessly exposed, Sarkar.
Absolutely, George. And you know something? One thing which personally, and I'm sure you'll know much more knowledge about this, health conditions aside, if the Democrats believe that Trump is the guy who is supposedly winning elections in 2016 on the back of Russian interference, well, they got a surprise in Biden, whose son left the army, got a top post in some Ukrainian company. Trump, who was one of the most pro-war candidates, we all know what him and Obama did in the Middle East since 2011. Biden. And these guys, I know what the Democrats did in 2016 when Sanders could have once again been the presidential nominee. We all know how the rigged votes got Hillary in front. It's a bit of a deja vu. Sanders was going absolutely fine. Suddenly things are going topsy-turvy. The Iowa thing was an absolute shambles. Voting happens, but for 2 or 3 days, no one knows what the results are. There has to be an app, a soft copy. Well, who's the one who's rigging elections now? Should I say primaries now? What's wrong with having a paper trail? Will they be exposed?
Yeah, especially, I mean, it wasn't even a primary, it was a caucus. All you needed was somebody with a pencil and paper to count the heads.
Oh, man, common sense is not so common anymore, George.
In the halls. Yeah, it is incredible, but you heard from Jonathan Davies, who I'm not in any way insulting him. I mean this sincerely, that he speaks for the 1%. He deals with the 1% every day. That's how he makes his living. They like Trump. They think Trump is wonderful. And of course, the 1% are present not just in the Republican Party, but also in the Democrats. Many thanks for your call, Sarkar. My old friend Chris is in Redcar. At least I think it's that Chris. Go ahead, Chris.
Good. How are you? Are you all right? Are you self-isolating?
I'm fine. We're all the family are fine by the grace of God so far. What about you? I went to your one-man show. It was utterly incredible, brilliant.
Thank you very much. I had the same response. I had four standing ovations over the 4 nights.
Yeah, well, you definitely got a standing ovation when I was there.
Well, that's all great. Unfortunately, I mean, I opened all kinds of doors after that run, but unfortunately, like everybody else in the country, everything has just come to a
crunching halt. Yeah.
So, I mean, for me personally, I mean, I don't know what's going to happen when all this blows over. If that's too glib a statement, or when it all stops, you know.
I've got my doubts if it'll ever blow over. At least not in the near future. I don't agree at all with people who think, you know, the football season will be on again in May or whatever. I just don't believe it. Anyway, Chris, that's not what you phoned up for. I beg your pardon. Go ahead.
Well, no, listen. I regard you as a friend of mine, so I don't mind. I always mind. I don't mind a bit of banter, George. But there's two points I want to make. The first one is about is the panic buying thing.
Yeah.
I mean, listen. I live a very austere kind of existence myself, and I went into Morrison's yesterday, and I mean, people were acting like absolute idiots, you know. And I thought to myself, well, why don't they just to combat the panic buying and to make sure that there's enough for everybody to go around? All they're going to do is just take away the supermarket trolleys. Just take away the trolleys, take away people's ability to stack them up with food, and just give them baskets. Just have a basket or 2 baskets.
It's a very good point. I was in Tesco today. I very purposefully, and people were looking. I very purposely took just one of everything that I needed, even though, you know, normally I would have taken more. And it was in a basket. There was no trolley. There's no reason why we can't do that. It's a brilliant suggestion.
But you see, the thing is, George, it was on the ITV News last night. There was one lady on there, and she said, and I couldn't believe it, over £1 billion has been taken by supermarkets in this country in the last week.
Yeah.
And so
that's why they don't do it, of course, Chris.
That's why they're not taking away the trolleys.
Yeah.
You know, so I mean, if this thing is to work, then the government should be saying, okay, then, you know, take away the trolleys, because you see, all of this thing, all this panic, it's all leading to a climate of fear. And people being at risk, and the fear, and it's just all cumulative. Do you know what I mean? So just start to put things into place to take away that fear and to take away that panic. Do you know what I mean? And for me, to ease people's minds when they go into a store. I mean, my daughter I've got like six grandchildren, as you know.
Yeah.
Like my daughter's being passed herself. My 2-year-old granddaughters, twin granddaughters. And my newly born grandson, Miles, they need milk. You know what I mean? And they're going into the stores and they can't get it.
Yeah, it's unconscionable. So, the government can't allow this to continue or trouble. You could get trouble. I talked earlier, Chris, about the stores, not supermarkets, but small stores, selling hand gel at 20 quid and paracetamol at 10 quid. People are going to take the law into their own hands.
Yeah, there's been like wagons or vans pulling up outside of shops and clubs in Middlesbrough and Teesside and that, pulling up and selling toilet rolls from the back of vans and hand sanitizer of like 5 or 6 quid a time. There was one bloke selling packs of toilet paper for 12 quid. They'll create like a black market economy through being stupid. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Well, that was my first point. But the second point, and this is like really worrying me. It's this coronavirus bill that looks as though it's going to be pushed through on Tuesday. And I mean, for me, when I looked at it, some of the things. I mean, this thing's going to be kept in place for 2 years, you know. And it's like the police having the powers to arrest people on suspicion of having this virus and holding them in quarantine for a week or two or an indefinite period. People being held in mental hospitals and hospitals. No public gatherings, no protest, no dissent. And I'm thinking to myself, my word, it hasn't taken our government long to seize upon this opportunity to bring in yet another swathe of like really, really freedom quenching, civil liberty starving kind of laws on the back of this thing. And I mean, that's fair enough if they feel the need to have to do that, but to keep them in place for 2 years.
Well, 2 years is not a long time for legislation. It's a sunset clause. It means that the law dies in 2 years. Doesn't mean it will be kept for 2 years. But I'm not really with you on that, Chris. You know, I think in a war, you have to make sacrifices of civil liberties. In the Second World War, we had to sacrifice a lot of civil liberties. Everything had to be bent to the war effort. I think this is a war. I'm just sorry we don't have a proper Churchill rather than a pound shop Churchill at the wheel. Unfortunately, we'll need to cut that short because there's actually scores of people trying to get through. It's been a pleasure, as always, talking to you. Eves is in Idaho. Let's hear from him. Eves.
Hello, George. Thank you for your show. Your show is really beautiful, and you know, beauty is rare right now.
Thank you, sir.
I want to tell you, I have a son in France, and he's an ICU resident, you know, and what's interesting about him is that he was also an aeronautical engineer, and then he went to medical school. So he has a quantitative view of things. And what he says is that to monitor the crisis, the real important thing is to measure how many serious cases do you have, basically how many people are hospitalized, and how many ICU beds do you have available. And when you don't have enough ICU beds, what you do is you move your patients somewhere else, like they do in France right now. They are moving from the east to the south. And when everything is saturated, you end up with Italy. And what it means is that when 5 people come to your emergency room, if you have the respirator, you are going to save 4 of them. When you don't have any more ventilator, you say in English. And when you don't have any more ventilator, you lose 5 of them. And that's the difference, if you want, between Italy and Germany.
It is
and that's what you have to...
And where does France fit in, Yves? Is France not as good as Germany, but better than Italy?
Well, what happened with France is a little bit twofold, you see. At the beginning, they were just as bad as Italy. But then they reacted, and the south of France really separated. You know, they started to block the train and everything. So the south of France is resisting right now. And what it means by resisting is that they're not saturated, you see, because this is really... You know, it's like a shock wave. You know, what is a shock wave? A shock wave is when the perturbation goes as fast as the perturbation itself, and so it becomes a gigantic pressure gradient, and you hear a big bang. And that's what happened. People are coming in, but it takes a long time, and more people are coming in, and that's what you have.
Yves, thank you for that insight from Idaho into the situation in France. Now, you heard the rather incongruent bluster from our wealth advisor, Jonathan Davies, about Venezuela earlier, clearly pre-scripted and designed to get me going, but I thought I kept my cool quite well. My next guest is an expert on Venezuela and an expert on the sanctions that have strangled the people of Venezuela. He's also an expert on Iran, and an Iranian is dying every 10 minutes, not because of the Iranian government's perfidy or imperfections, no, because Iran is under the same kind of murderous economic blockade by the wonderful USA as Venezuela is. I don't know if Dr. Tim Anderson, the wonderful, prolific author who's on a book tour right now, although I'm sure it's been hit by the coronavirus. I don't know if you heard the earlier part of the show, but I welcome to this part. Dr. Tim, Australian academic extraordinaire, welcome to London. Sorry we're not able to afford you the kind of hospitality we would in normal times. We'll come on to what's happened to your tour in a minute. But let's start with Venezuela, which was rather savagely traduced earlier in the show by one of our experts, financial experts. What's the situation with coronavirus in Venezuela and why?
Well, the situation is, as you say, there are parallels with Iran because Washington has doubled down on their economic blockade of Venezuela and Iran, specifically to try and damage the population. Now, that's been a bit more damaging to Iran in recent weeks, and there are less cases in Venezuela. But in both countries, there is what the US doesn't have, a public health system, which is how one of the main follow-up reasons or follow-up factors that allows the country to get a grip on it. And Iran is starting to come out. There are large numbers of people starting to recover now. In Venezuela, the numbers aren't quite as much.
In Iran, the situation is desperate. It is on Italian levels, maybe worse. How confident are you that they're going to be able to keep a lid on it? Or are we looking at a truly biblical level of plague in Iran?
Well, it was very bad just a few days ago, George, but as I said, there is a public health system there. There is a political will to address the problem, despite the blockade that's stopping certain materials getting into Iran. And they have started to announce large numbers of people recovering. The big hotspot in the last 24 hours is actually the US. The US has really exploded in the number of new cases. And the problem there is they don't really have a public health system at all.
No, quite. It's a point I tried to make to our expert earlier. It is actually, to me, quite surprising that there is a flight to the dollar, because I think, A, the United States economy fundamentals are deeply flawed. It is politically unstable, and it's going to be hit worse than anywhere else, in my view, by the coronavirus, which may even have started in the United States. As I pointed out last week, if Ohio genuinely has 100,000 cases, and they didn't tell us until last week, who knows when this virus first emerged and where?
Yes, they've detected large numbers in New York just recently.
Huge numbers. And half of California, the governor thinks, half of California, that's 25 million people, are going to be affected there. Does this affect the United States' ability to wage war, or its willingness, rather, to wage war rather than ability? It clearly still has the hardware, but does it have the soft power to do so? Are you thinking that, as I'm thinking, that U.S. Interventions and wars in Yemen, in Syria, in Libya, and so on, are beginning to run out of steam?
Well, they are losing, and they know that they're losing, but they continue with those wars. And let's recall, the war that you oppose so vigorously in Iraq too. They're losing in Iraq. They're losing in Syria. They're losing the Saudi-led war against Yemen. And it's true that their economy is not really in its fundamentals. You wouldn't seem to be supporting their capacity to do this, except for the fact that there are so many other countries that are invested in the US dollar. And effectively, it means that other countries are paying for the projection of their military power.
Extraordinary. Now, tell us, we're short of time, tell us what the virus has done to your book tour, and tell us about the book you're touring.
Well, you're right. I came at a bad time. There were some restrictions, and they've increased, and things have shut down. So I'm going home tomorrow. Basically, I was going to the Middle East, but I managed to do some interviews, including with your wonderful program and some other groups. So I'll go back, and I was going to go to the Middle East to promote the Arabic version of the book. But anyway, these things go on, and life goes on, and we have to deal with wars and
tell us about the book. What's the title? Where can people get it? And what's it about?
The title is Axis of Resistance Towards an Independent Middle East. It is on Amazon. It's available in the UK, and you can look it up. And it's published in the US, but it's available on Amazon in the UK. And it's about all of the Middle East wars and how we have to understand all of the 8 different wars to understand really what's going on there.
I've already read it, and it's absolutely first class. As are you. Dr. Tim Anderson, I'm sorry you're having to go back down under so quickly. I hope you'll come back and see us very soon indeed. Emails are coming in thick and fast. The EU and the USA have shown themselves to be paper tigers. Coronavirus has highlighted how weak they are. China and Russia have stood tall and reacted very decisively. That's from Tony. And James in Dundee, my hometown, says, Joe Biden gives me the creeps. I also believe he has dementia. And furthermore, I think if he gets made the president, he'll have Hillary Clinton as the vice president. And I believe that Biden will be deemed not fit for president after a few months. And then Lady Macbeth, Hillary would then at last be president by default. You can call him a conspiracy theorist if you like, but he may very well be right. George, this is a country view from James. I think we all know how much you hate Donald Trump, but you cannot blame this guy for the coronavirus or who the Democrats put up against him. I personally think he's done some good for his own country, my opinion. I also believe the presidential vote will be postponed until this virus is under control, but you will badmouth him regardless. The guy ain't all bad. Cut him a bit of slack, says James Trump. Sorry, just James. James, I said in 2016, I'm not happy that Donald Trump is the president of the United States, but I'm very happy that Hillary Clinton isn't. I've told you that a state of war exists between me and Joe Biden. What more can you expect from me? You want me to like Donald Trump? Christopher Rogers says, oh, that's Christopher in Hong Kong. He's trying to get through. I've tried the phone line, no luck. If you want a comparative analysis of COVID-19 measures in Hong Kong, China, and the UK, latest stats out of China from research papers, and just a feel of what's happening on our streets, give me a buzz. Please call Christopher Rogers in Hong Kong. Another message, this virus has not emerged in China from animal markets, as they have been doing this for thousands of years. This virus was planted by someone who is attacking China, Iran, and Italy, as they've joined the Chinese Silk Road. That's a conspiracy too far for me, that one. And Kevin says, I predict that not long after it is announced there will be a world financial crash and the coronavirus will disappear. Oh dear. And Richard McGuinness says, nice hat, by the way. This is the first time I've seen you on YouTube. I think you're great. I was on holiday last week, was told not to go back to work. and not to go back to where I live. I'm a chef. My job is in London and I love it, but now I'm homeless with no job. Have to go on. We'll beat this and we will move on. Richard McGuinness, thank you indeed for that. How's the poll going? Just about 2,000 have voted. Too draconian, 10%. Not tough enough, 72%. And about right, 18%. All no change. Got about 6 minutes left to vote on my Twitter feed on that. A good friend of mine has just died from coronavirus in England. Steph Peart died yesterday at home while self-isolating. I saw her a few weeks ago when I was visiting from New Zealand. She was in great form then. Now she is dead. We must make sure that she and others have not died in vain. Urgent action is needed by all governments. The delays that most countries are continuing will cause unnecessary deaths. That's from John Rothery. I'm sorry for your loss, John. And Jim says, here in the American oligarchy, we're noticing a whole lot of freedoms being just handed away in the name of stopping COVID-19. Well, I'm perfectly good with draconian measures to combat a pandemic. I'm particularly suspicious of the types of surveillance bills being considered, which basically are saying you'll get your freedoms back whenever we feel like it. Well, I'm not sure what freedoms you had already, to be honest. And if we are so angry after it is over, we'll take whatever they've taken from us back again. But the civil liberty to spread disease is not a civil liberty I myself will fight for. My right to swing my right arm ends just about a centimetre, a millimetre from the end of your nose. I have no right to harm you because I'm taking away your civil right to live. Fatima is on the line from Bolton. Let's hear from her. Fatima, welcome.
Hi, thank you. Good evening. How are you?
Good evening. Yes, by the grace of God, I'm good. What would you like to say?
So I'm a pharmacy student right now. I've just finished my placement last week, working in a community pharmacy. And unfortunately, working there, I realized that this is a sector in the healthcare that's been ignored almost. The pharmacists didn't have a mask, didn't have any gloves. There was barely any hand sanitizers going around enough for the pharmacy staff. And, we read on social media, online, there's a shortage of masks for the doctors and for the nurses, which is true. And they are getting the support, I think, and not enough support, really. But they are getting the recognition, and I feel like pharmacists are sort of being neglected. And I feel like this is a sector in healthcare that is vital right now because, aside from the corona patients, there are thousands of patients who still need, blister packs, elderly patients who need that support from the pharmacist, people with asthma, people with diabetes, methadone patients. And I feel like if the pharmacists are not protected almost, like the doctors and the nurses, these patients will suffer. So I guess it's just making a point that...
That's a very good point, and one which is thrown up by the government's SHIELD initiative today, where they say they're going to try and protect the 1.5 million people with chronic underlying conditions that are most at risk of dying in the epidemic. The people who know them best are the pharmacists, because they've been dealing with them for many years. That's where they get their prescription. And so you're right, we need not only recognition of pharmacies, local pharmacies, but support for them. And the very least you can expect is a mask and a pair of gloves and hand gel to wash your hands with. Fatima, thanks very much indeed for that call. Kevin says, George, calm down, man. There's no need to shout. There's a chance you're going to cause more panic. Take a chill pill. Let me enjoy the show. Well, you're not here to enjoy the show, Kevin. You're here to be educated by it. You're here to be inspired by it. I didn't come here tonight at the risk of my own health, maybe life, as a person in a risk category, being over the age of 60, to entertain you, though I hope it has been entertaining, most weeks at least. I came here to discuss with you, to debate with you and others. on whether we're on the right track in order to stay alive, to watch and listen to anything at all in the weeks, months and years ahead. This is a time of life or death, Kevin. I'm angry about the guilty men. That's why occasionally I shout, though I'm not shouting. No, this is my stage voice, Kevin. I'm performing here. I'm projecting here. I'm projecting my voice all over the world, as you're already aware of. I'm sorry if you think that is going to cause more panic. I'm actually keeping calm, and I'm carrying on. But don't expect me, please, not to be angry. I'm angry at the state we're in. Here's the news with Tom Fanshawe.
Curious about our curriculum? Have something to say? Then call us now to join the debate on the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
Tune in every Tuesday to Loud and Clear for a regular segment called False Prophets, a weekly look at Wall Street and corporate capitalism, where we talk about the big economic issues of the week from the point of view of working people, the poor, and the U.S. position in the global economy. Join us this Tuesday and every Tuesday with financial policy analyst Daniel Sankey right here on Radio Sputnik.
It's time to double down with Max and Stacy.
Yeah, double down. We're talking markets, finance, business, economics, ka-ching, bling, just about everything money related on Sputnik. It's called Double Down.
We're asking, are dead cats bouncing or have fundamentals changed? That's this week on Double Down.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Radio Sputnik News.
The number of diagnosed cases of coronavirus has passed 300,000, with more than 13,000 deaths around the world. In the Italian region of Lombardy, the epicenter of the Italian outbreak, controls have been tightened as the country confirmed more than 53,500 cases of COVID-19. The number of people in Italy to have died from the disease is approaching 5,000, just days after it overtook China as the nation to register most deaths from the highly contagious respiratory illness. Officials say a further 739 patients have died in a single day, taking the total number to 4,825. Sports and other physical activities outside have been banned, even if a person is exercising alone, and using vending machines is also forbidden. The increase of 19.6% was by far the biggest daily rise since the outbreak emerged in the country a month ago. A team of 65 Cuban doctors and nurses with experience in battling Ebola was due to arrive in the hard-hit Lombardy town of Cremina today, ready to help. Spain has registered 394 deaths from coronavirus in a single day. The United Kingdom could be put on lockdown if Britons continue to ignore advice aimed at slowing the spread of coronavirus. Housing Secretary Robert Jenrick is warning that asking people to stay at home in an attempt to suppress the number of cases was not a game, as he refused to rule out tougher action. 11 more people have died after testing positive in Britain, taking the total as of Sunday to 244. The British government has closed cafes, pubs, bars, restaurants and gyms for the foreseeable future as the spread of the virus continues to accelerate. But the UK has not yet followed the example of France, which is now requiring citizens to carry official paperwork in order to leave their homes. And New York City is 10 days away from seeing widespread shortages of supplies. That's according to the city's mayor. One of the world's busiest urban rail systems will be shut down for ordinary commuters from tomorrow morning to prevent the spread of coronavirus infection in Mumbai, one of India's most populous cities. Only government workers in essential services will be allowed to travel on the truncated service. 8 million people use Mumbai's crowded suburban rail network every day. And while California residents are being told to stay at home to prevent the spread of the disease, and all non-essential businesses and areas are being closed down, officials in Los Angeles are making sure that marijuana is still available to the public. Marijuana dispensaries are still being deemed as essential businesses and allowed to remain open. The decision to postpone this summer's Tokyo Olympics and Paralympic Games in Japan needs to be made now, according to the British Olympic champion Callum Skinner. The cyclist who fronts competitor-led movement Global Athletes says both should be rescheduled until the COVID-19 global pandemic is under control. He warned boycotts could ensue with the health of athletes at risk. In an interview, he said people think Olympians are superheroes, but they're just normal people and fall ill like everyone else. In other news, American country music legend Kenny Rogers has died aged 81. He passed away peacefully at home from natural causes. Rogers topped pop and country charts during the 1970s and 80s and won 3 Grammy Awards in a career spanning more than 6 decades. Dolly Parton, who duetted with Rogers on the hit Islands in the Stream, tweeted, "You never know how much you love someone until they've gone. I've had so many wonderful years and wonderful times with my friend Kenny, but above all, the music and the success, I've loved him as a wonderful man and a true friend." And finally, the world is doomed with only a few years left, according to a British academic. Jem Bendel, a professor in sustainable leadership at the University of Cumbria, is the author of an academic article, Deep Adaptation, a Map of Navigating Climate Tragedy, which has become the closest thing to a manifesto for a generation of self-described climate doomers. In it, he argues that it's too late for us to avoid the inevitability of a societal collapse caused by climate change. Instead, we're facing a near-term breakdown of civilization. Near-term meaning within a decade. The paper was rejected for publication by a peer-reviewed journal, whose reviewers said its language was not appropriate for an academic article. Bendel self-published the 34-page article online instead. It soon went viral. It's now been downloaded more than 500,000 times. However, his doom-laden predictions have been dismissed by prominent climate scientists. And that's Sputnik News.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway. Only on Sputnik Radio.
Well, it is interesting, our poll. We're going to keep it going, by the way, right up until 10 o'clock. No second poll tonight. How have Western governments' response to the crisis been too draconian? Only 10% of you think that. That's very interesting. And B, not tough enough, 72%. And 18% thinking about right. That's more or less 2,000 votes cast. Do let me know in the next hour where you stand on that. Means that the Twitter sphere, which is full of the libertarian opposition to draconian measures, is a minority sport, even here on the mother of all talk shows. Just before I go to our own medic, Moats medic, Dr. Ranjeet Brar, I want to read this missive from Stephanie in Paris. Hello, Mr. Galloway. I am a cardiac intensive care unit nurse working and living in Paris. The capital, as you must know, has been transformed into a ghost town. Fear is reigning everywhere. It's literally like a Hollywood movie. We are being asked to put dead patients in special bags and forbid their families from paying their final goodbyes. We have to wear expired masks due to shortages. I'm working extra hours due to staff shortages. I'm not complaining about my work, but for years and months, we've been on strikes, exposing the work conditions and the poor payrolls here. And this problem, I think, is global, not only in France. Now we are being exhausted. The question is, will the governments around the world learn from this pandemic and start to invest more in healthcare, research, and scientists instead of investing in weapons and wars? It breaks my heart to see that football stars are being paid millions while I have to put my life at risk to save patients and being paid nearly nothing. I hope that this pandemic will give governments the wake-up call that we have all been waiting for and to reconsider their priorities. Otherwise, all of this would have been for nothing. And this is my greatest fear. Thank you. From Stephanie. I wanted to read that, not just because it is incredibly powerful and from our nearest neighbour, France, but because I happen to know that these are the feelings of our own expert, Dr. Ranjeet, who joins me now. Dr. Ranjeet, a very powerful missive from France. I expect that's the feeling amongst health service workers here in Britain, is it?
Thanks, George. Pleasure to be back with you on the show again. Are you hearing me okay? I'm not seeing you.
Very well.
Good stuff. Yeah, I think the medical implications people are becoming more and more aware of. The economic and social implications of this are continuing to unfold. That message I just heard you read it is powerful and unquestionably poignant and topical. It made me recall, a few statistics. We know that 850 billion is spent annually by the United States on its military. When a fraction of that, perhaps 30 billion, would be enough to eliminate hunger in the world. We know that there are a very small minority of billionaires who hold between them, in fact, 6 or 7 billionaires who hold between them the same amount of money as half the world's population. These are facts and statistics which are not new. Not long ago in our own National Health Service, I was involved in fighting against the imposition of a junior doctor's contract, which I was very worried and my colleagues were worried about, was leading to a downgrade of pay, downgrade of conditions, making it less attractive and less easy to recruit and retain junior doctors. At the same time, the nurses' bursary was being taken away. Nursing has traditionally been, a profession that's open to intelligent and predominantly working class young women, but also men who can't afford to pay tuition fees for long periods of time to support that noble profession. We know that conditions for nurses were getting so bad. Not long ago, I was working in the capital, in St. Mary's Hospital. I knew nurses who couldn't really afford to carry on working, were having to leave the jobs that they loved. We know that there are cases of nurses being on food banks has been a topic within elections. So the chronic understaffing and underfunding of our NHS is something that we really need to look at and address. We know that capacity, we've discussed before, has been going lower and lower. And this crisis, like every winter crisis, actually highlights this problem. But this crisis is perhaps bringing it in a really sharpened and acute form before the workers of our country and of the world. Why is it that we have only perhaps 8,000 ITU beds when even a country like Germany, yes, slightly larger but not incomparable, would have as many as 35,000? A case regarding the junior doctor's contract was when that contract was imposed, we had our whistleblowing protection removed so that junior doctors who brought to the public attention facts that they thought were making the NHS unsafe in this trajectory of privatisation and cuts actually were denied and debarred from training. There's a very famous case of a medic called Chris Day. Maybe worth you trying to get him on the show. Not someone you'd accuse of being left-wing, but someone who he would accuse of very much caring about the care that he delivered. Whilst he was working at a PFI hospital in southeast London, he found that the staffing levels were so low at night that he, as a junior doctor, was looking after 12 patients in ICU by himself. He felt this was unsafe. He raised it repeatedly within the hospital. He raised it during his training ARCP. And when he raised it, he was, while initially praised for being a good and conscientious doctor, subsequently denied his training, denied his number, and denied his career, essentially. So there are real problems that are underlying the delivery or the difficulty in our NHS delivering the kind of care which is needed at this crisis time. That said, I know that my colleagues are struggling to do the absolute best that they can with what they have and the resources they have. And you have to say, if we talked a week ago and felt that very few measures were being taken and made certain demands, it's as if, a higher government source was listening to your show, George, because huge amount of action has been taken, you have to agree, on a daily basis, more and more economic measures being taken. But the NHS itself is short of equipment, is short of staff, and I'm afraid that despite our best efforts, we will struggle if we really are 2 weeks behind the curve and we start to see the scenes that we're witnessing, the horrendous, the tragic, but perhaps in hindsight, avoidable scenes that we're seeing in Lombardy today.
Yes, there are many things arise from what you just said. Most of my demands from last week have now been realized, not them all. And of course, some of them cannot be realized in a week or a month because they are the bitter fruits of 40 years, as I put it, of neoliberal politics. It's not just the Tories, for those auto-laborites who like to date all these problems from 2010. As a matter of fact, they date from 1979, 1980, and it will take longer time to resolve those. And one of them is that we've been living under the illusion that we have a national health service, the pride of the world, an example to the world. People look at, they still say it about the BBC and they still say it about the NHS. But in fact, quietly, silently, more or less silently, large parts of the NHS have been undermined, underfunded, so profoundly, and deliberately so that privatization would be seen as the only appropriate cure. And for those who could afford it and had no ideological quibble about doing it, why don't you go into the private health sector? In fact, the National Health Service has been quietly murdered over 40 years, hasn't it?
I think that's an entirely reasonable and sadly accurate point, George, and there's a number of reasons why that has happened. Of course, Ernest Bevin first said that in order to create the NHS, he had to stuff the mouths of the consultants with gold, was his famous quote, that he had to preserve private practice, enable certain elements of the private medical system to survive. And while that became very much a minority system for many years, as the Keynesian consensus, if you like, of social welfare has gradually unfolded, the NHS itself has been seen as a ripe fruit for businessmen to pick at. And certainly it's the case, I can't go into the whole policy, but the bringing forth of the internal market so that all of the NHS was divided up into different trusts who barter, who sell services to each other rather than planning. If you're a family and you know what you need and you know what you have, you can plan to procure what you need. This system, which is a socialist idea and is extremely efficient, has been decried by the Tories for a long time. Many of their backbenchers, if you look it up, you can look on Google and you can find that they decry the NHS as a Stalinist system. Oliver Letwin and I think John MacDonald, Oliver Letwin and one of his colleagues came up with a concept under Thatcher to privatise the NHS. They called it Britain's biggest enterprise. You can look that up and see it again on Bob Gill's excellent movie, The Great NHS Heist. And they talked about the ways in which you could gradually pick off what they called peripheral services. So when I was very young, before I was a doctor, long before I was a doctor, the Hillingdon Hospital workers were fighting a strike because the cleaners at Hillingdon Hospital were being privatised. They were actually being sacked and asked to be re-employed by a private company doing the same job but at a substantially reduced wage, without benefits, without holidays, without sick leave. And this, as we've seen now, as a process that is run throughout the NHS, Capita and various other companies have come in. They run the kitchens, they run the cleaning, they run the carpentry, they run initially peripheral services, maintenance. Then, of course, there was the PFI. And increasingly, they've taken even central services. So, first of all, elective surgery, things which you could make some money up, was sold off to private interests to provide. And bit by bit, albeit under the stamp of the NHS, more and more of our healthcare is provided by the private sector. And of course, that means under the 2011 Health and Social Care Act, actually Matt Hancock, though he's the Secretary of State for Health, does not have responsibility for the day-to-day running of the NHS. Boris, as we pointed out previously, found himself unable to manipulate and change the plans of the NHS. This was before the COVID crisis, when he promised the northern constituencies and his Brexit constituency that there would be some material benefit that accrued to the NHS. And we see this again, and there's been almost deadly silence from Simon Stevens, the chief executive of the NHS, who should be responding to and running this crisis. Italy has commandeered and nationalized, essentially, its private medicine in the face of this overwhelming emergency in order to help deal with the situation. Britain has taken a cop-out, if you like. It's very keen to preserve private medicine and the privilege of private medicine, and therefore it's offering huge amounts of money, millions per day, to contract out services.
2.4 million just for the beds alone.
Absolutely.
Let's go back to how things are on the front line. I mean, you're a heart surgeon. My wife will be expecting to go in just a couple of months, 3 months, for delivery. Are the hospitals doing any other work, or are they completely swamped with this? Are you doing much heart surgery? Are the labour wards going to be open in July when my wife goes in?
Thanks, George. Just correct one small point. I'm actually not a cardiac. I'm a vascular surgeon, which is a fine point that not everyone will appreciate. But I'm an arterial surgeon, yeah. And yes, we are performing still emergency surgery. And actually, in a specialty where perhaps 70% of our workload is made up of emergent and urgent cases, so things that can't be put off because they are life and limb saving. We perform operations when people have had strokes, operations when people are bleeding from ruptured aneurysms, operations to save people's legs. These things can't be put off. Anything that can be put off, the elective surgery, the hernia surgery, the varicose vein surgery, things that have real material benefit to patients, but doesn't need to be performed precisely at this moment. We're doing our best to defer that. I've been running telephone clinics this week. I've been trying to contact my patients, go through their results without them having to come into the hospital. Many of my patients are elderly. They have multiple comorbidities, the diabetes, the cardiac disease, obviously the peripheral vascular disease. They've had previous strokes, some of them have impaired renal function. So all of these patients are particularly at risk if they come into contact with patients who have the coronavirus, and therefore we're doing our very best to keep them away from hospital so long as we can manage their conditions in a safe way, at least temporarily. If we can temporize and put off their appointments, that is the best thing. And if patients don't feel that they're in urgent need of attention, they should absolutely do their best to contact the hospital. They might find it hard. They might find the hospital is trying to contact them, as we have been doing, in order to defer care that can be put off. Currently, if you look at what's happening throughout accident emergency departments and intensive care departments, they're doing their very best to expand their capacity with what they have. That means A&Es are being divided up into respiratory areas and non-respiratory areas. China this week published a fantastic document from Zhejiang University. I don't think I'm pronouncing that quite right, but a medical school hospital in the Wuhan area, which summates its experience in dealing with coronavirus. And
fantastic part of that document. They've sent it all around the world, yeah.
They have, and I really highly recommend my colleagues in the medical profession to look at it. The National Institute of Clinical Excellence have published some emergency documentation, but it's very limited. A lot of it is about triaging patients, about assessing their fitness for intensive care. But the latest really modern healthcare system that has done such an excellent job is China. This summates their experience, including their reference and experience with antiviral drugs, because our own local recommendation is still that there aren't antiviral drugs that work. That's not the experience of the Chinese. They have found particularly lopinavir and ritonavir, which are protease inhibitors, to be useful, and also some anti-TNF-alpha drugs, which can be inhaled for patients who have this severe respiratory syndrome, the SARS part of the infection, as a nebulized medication that's being produced by China and Cuba in collaboration. And I think, as I just heard on your news, it's for that reason that a large group of Cuban scientists and medicals and medical personnel are in fact going to Lombardy to supplement the impressive Chinese aid, which has been in such stark contrast, for example, to the European Union.
I'm amazed, Doctor, at the absolute silence and inaction from both the EU and the US. There's a lot of Italian Americans. They've all got votes. I would have thought for that reason alone, Trump would be sending airplanes to Italy, trying to do what he could, but they're not. And the EU, as I said at the beginning of the show, have actually fined Italy in the last 10 days, 12 days, rather than come to help them. But let's look at the Italian example. Many people say that we're on the same road as the Italians, in which case the next few months are going to be very, very grim indeed for us. If our numbers, and our number of deaths, by the way, is increasing more quickly than the Italian was at that stage of the epidemic. But let's say we become Italy, Doctor. Can we cope with that? And if we can't cope with it, what's going to happen?
It's a very pertinent question. It's a very uncomfortable question to have to ask. As a doctor, as a medical professional, myself, my colleagues are very used to doing our best to reassure the public that we have their best interests at heart, that we're doing the best with the medical knowledge we have, that we have excellent technology and facilities to help them. But if we go the way of Italy announced a further 5,500 cases today, and they are overwhelmed by deaths, 650 deaths today. This is, of course, on top of normal service and normal mortality that we'd see in any population. They have an elderly population, as do we. They have a comorbid population, as do we. I think if there was one aspect, and we can talk about the economic things perhaps another time, but if there's one aspect of the medical care that I really think still needs changing and needs drastic changing, it's the ability to test on a much more widespread level. I have colleagues that I've worked with that I've found have become positive, but they themselves are only tested because they had been to high-risk geographical areas. Our criteria for testing are now woefully inadequate. It's generalized amongst the population. We know this. Many people, intensive care units, for example, in Norfolk Park, a hospital where I worked and trained and is as a very dear place in my heart, serving the population of northwest London, announced that they were overwhelmed by the number of cases they had in their intensive care unit. We're doing our best to divide our A&Es into respiratory and non-respiratory zones. But when you compare that to the efforts, the whole of society, economically, medically, socially, scientifically, was mobilized in China in order to get a lid on this. Now, China are worried that having got a lid on it, they still have a large percentage of the population, more than 99% of the population, who have not been exposed, and therefore the importance of a vaccine is clear if we don't want this to recur in larger portions and outbreaks to happen again. But they're in a very privileged position to once again just be worrying about a vaccine. I'm worried, as my colleagues are worried, about our capacity for patients who don't need intubation, our capacities who will need intensive care. And if we're going to do anything, as the World Health Organization have repeatedly emphasized to us over this period, we've got to roll out our testing on a much wider scale. And if that means requisitioning laboratories, this reverse transcriptase PCR reaction to actually identify the RNA tests from simple oropharyngeal swabs from patients, so just taking a swab from the nose and the mouth and sending it to a lab, it is possible to get a result. That should be scientifically possible in a country such as ours, which remains the 5th richest country on earth. And if we can give 330 billion to business, if we can support wages, and I think we should be supporting wages of people who are laid off at this time, it worries me still that with the closure of schools, there may be 3 or 4 million children who don't have their nutritional needs met adequately. And we, again, highlighting this point, we need to do some soul searching as a country to ask ourselves why the 5th richest nation on earth is in that situation.
Well, on that point, and finally, How can it be that the fifth or sixth richest country in the world hasn't even got enough face masks for its doctors and nurses, that they're reusing equipment that is not for reuse? How is that even possible?
You're right, there isn't enough personal protective equipment. Now, if you look at that document from China was very interesting because they talked about how to arrange the fever clinic and also the levels of personal protective equipment that were necessary for such an infective agent. And it is much more akin to, the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, working with these highly infectious agents, Ebola. I mean, it's these kind of levels of personal protection which go well beyond the normal clinical that we're used to that. So there's a huge increase in demand. That's no question. And that's not just this country, it's worldwide. Supply chains under capitalism, everything that we make and everything that we consume in this country is no longer made in this country. So it does need repurposing. It does need us to think about the way our economy is run. But of course, the other thing is that our country runs in a way where, yes, we have a large state sector, but overwhelmingly what you see is that the national debt, is publicized, is made public. So things which are loss-making enterprise are in public hands. Things which make wealth are in private hands. So there's a huge amount of wealth in this country. This country is awash with money in some regards, but its distribution is extremely uneven. So that despite the very wealth that our country has had for centuries as a part of its history, I'm afraid we have a huge resurgence of poverty, and it means that our state institutions don't have the ability of their own accord to immediately mobilize and rectify those systemic errors. And that's the legacy of the last certainly 35, 40 years.
Dr. Ranjeet Brar, thank you as always for a mesmerizing tour of the horizon of the coronavirus 19. Let's take a quick break. I'm well late for that. Go ahead.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Tune in every Thursday to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for the regular segment called Veterans for Peace, where we focus on the contemporary issues of war and peace that affect veterans, their families, the country, and the world as a whole. Veterans for Peace President Jerry Condon joins the show every Thursday. Hear about this and more every Thursday right here on Radio Sputnik.
We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
The mother of all talk shows, with George Galloway. The world is our classroom, and you're welcome to sit in and join the seminar.
Well, I'm afraid the phone system is melting down with demand, so I'm going to quickly go into calls for the rest of the show. Anna says, there are many lives at stake in the difference between Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, and between Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. Well said, Anna. And Steve in Wiltshire says, I'm digging a vegetable patch and planting food. Many of our friends are doing the same. Who knows what the future holds? Remember the Scouts motto, be prepared. Love the show. Keep up the good work. Thanks, Steve. That's exactly what we should have been doing. I was astounded to learn this week that 85% of our fruit and veg comes from abroad. Like this green and pleasant land can't grow fruit and veg? Really? My mother-in-law saw a fatigued nurse in the supermarket today in tears as she couldn't get any baby formula. It's heartbreaking, especially to see our NHS staff in despair. Alex McGuigan in Belfast. Thank you, Alex. Kevin Broom says, George, Jonathan Davies, I agree with him entirely. Top guest. He is a good guest, no doubt. Funny, that's too long to read. Joseph O'Regan, make it shorter next time, sir. Ali Al-Hakim says, my question is, what's your opinion of food supplies in a couple of months due to panic buying? Less workers making the food because of the disease and more transportation difficulties. Ali is an optometrist. I don't know the answer to that, but I'm told that there is no shortage of food and no need for panic buying it. Let's go to Darren in Ellesmere Port. Go ahead, Darren.
Hi there, how are you doing?
Good, thanks. Nice to hear from you. Go ahead.
It's, first of all, I want to say that the NHS staff are absolute heroes. I owe my life to them.
Yep.
But at the same time, I really can't, feel strongly enough for them. I spent God knows how many times in hospitals where I watched the NHS be broken down slowly and surely. It started with Cameron and Osborne, and maybe one day we're going to look back to those and see it as a crime against humanity, because there's wards that are open, there's beds that are there, but there isn't the staff to man them. And more and more, just as time has gone by, the NHS has got into worse and worse state, and yet we're constantly being told that they're spending more on it, and it's just not true.
Well, we may be in pure cash terms spending more on it, but by comparison with the demands upon it, we're not. And a very large amount of what we spend on it, Darren, is being paid out in interest charges to the private finance initiative schemes that Gordon Brown and Tony Blair introduced. Well, they didn't introduce them, but they multiplied them. Darren, I'm going to press on. Please forgive me for that. Guy is in Stoke-on-Trent. Go ahead, Guy.
Yeah, hi, George. George, it's about time that on some sort of national stage we get the numbers released from your consultant who did a fantastic job.
Yeah.
Just how few critical beds and ventilators we've got in the UK.
8,000 compared to 35,000 in Germany.
Yeah, now I've just got my figures off the Financial Times. They printed these in this year, March, so we can imagine they're going to be bona fide figures. But Germany have got roughly 4 times the number of critical care beds, ventilators that we've got.
And they've got 5 times as many ventilators, more than 4 times as many critical care beds.
Yeah, the point is they've got 5-6 times more. Now, what I'm really suspicious about is why this isn't in the public domain. The news and the commentators and the pundits are all over COVID-19, and no one has yet said how poorly we are equipped to deal with this problem.
When he has these press conferences, Guy, it's just an echo chamber in front of him. They're the privileged journalists, so they're throwing softballs at him.
I even heard a national radio station today. Someone asked about the German, because in Germany you've got a fraction of the fatalities to the UK. And I'm thinking now, it's got to come out now, the number of how better equipped they are. And the answer which was given, as far as I was concerned, was irrelevant. I'm thinking you cannot give that answer without releasing how poorly equipped our NHS has become. And if you factor into that, we're the 5th richest country in the world.
Yeah, couldn't make it up. Guy, it's wonderful to hear your voice again. Thanks for the call. Kevin is up next. He's in Suffolk. Go ahead, Kevin.
Hello, mate. Yeah, I was just calling in about Biden. I don't think they've got any intention of putting Biden forward. I think this is all about stopping Bernie.
You might be right, yeah. Maybe he'll drop out before the convention.
Well, I think it's obvious. I don't particularly have much personal sympathy with his politics, and I don't think he's a particularly nice guy. But to do this to somebody at his time of life is just like shocking. But I think this was about stopping Bernie. I think if you look at the coordination of what went on, the other 2 major candidates stood down just before the last primary, or the what do they call it, the Super Tuesday thing, to give him a clear run. So so as not to split the anti Bernie vote. So I think it was all about stopping Bernie, and I think what they're going to do is parachute. My suspicion is it's going to be Cuomo, Governor Cuomo, because he's having a very good war at the moment, if you want to talk about the COVID-19 thing as a war. And I don't think, I was just talking to your screener guy, I don't think they're going to try Hillary. I think she's done. I think they know she'd just basically push Pennsylvania and Ohio and places like that straight back into Trump's arms. So
very interesting, Kevin. I'm grateful for that speculation. It's informed, educated speculation. Maybe get some American calls on that in the remaining 20 minutes or so. Pat Fraser says, don't speak as a divine, perfect God, Galloway. You are not infallible, nor is Trump. But on the whole, I told you so mantra is lies at this stage of the game. He's a lot more useful, capable, and confident than you will ever be. That's Pat Fraser from Trump Towers somewhere. Thanks very much for that, Pat. Jock McTavish says, George chooses his battles. Doesn't everyone? I'll always admire him for the Senate speech, Syria, and the Skripals debunking, but he seems in 9/11 mode over this one. There you go. Michael is in New Jersey. He thinks COVID was invented in a lab. Go ahead, Michael.
Hello, sir.
Yeah.
You're mistaken. I don't think it was created in a lab. I know it was created in a laboratory.
Oh, well, we're about to hear you then.
Trump was in a high security meeting with the Department of Health and Human Services, and the room they were in was used only for bio-warfare. That was about a week ago. It wasn't right away. It was about a week ago. Furthermore, I've heard other evidence that it especially affects Asian people. So it was genetically created to affect Asian people more than others. This is a fact, sir. Furthermore, they don't reveal they came up with a
wait a minute. Stop. How does it affect Asian people more than others? Are you watching the scenes in Italy? Are you watching Italy? Are you watching New York?
So I know other people are affected. I said more grievously they're affected more than Asian people. Other people are affected also, but especially Asians. Let me continue a little, please, sir.
Yeah, go on.
Furthermore, they said they developed a vaccination or a cure about a couple of weeks after they knew what happened. Like a month or two ago, they created vaccination. They're testing it now. This has never been done before. How do they create something so quickly? And we know pharmaceuticals are more dangerous than they're helpful. Prove the medical system is a crocker. Pharmaceuticals are no good. I proved that in my book, A Loud and Clear Truth, which is almost finished. Furthermore, they don't tell us that vitamin C is highly preventive and curative. Vitamin C is good for all flus and colds. It prevents them, it cures them. Vitamin C in high dosage is very helpful, and they don't say that in the public. So what is this going on about pharmaceuticals they're testing up when they know vitamin C does a better job? This is basically created for the intentional effect of destroying the economy worldwide. This is an elite's job, and not the U.S. government.
Who wanted to destroy the economy worldwide?
Sir, if you don't know, there's powers. It runs by the Vatican along with the Illuminati. Illuminati were formed by Mayor
You lost me. You lost me at Illuminati. Thanks for the call. John is in Oregon. Let's hear from that state. Go ahead, John.
Yes, is this George Galloway?
Yes, you're on the air.
Yes. Hey, first of all, I'd like to tell you how grateful that the people here in America are for a rational voice, speaking about the absolutely criminal behavior of the governments of this world, not just America, but many governments. The never-ending war, the lies to bring us to war, the attacks with wanting to attack Iran, attacking Syria, attacking Libya. These are war crimes. Yep. I live in a country of war criminals, and I am sickened by the people in this country that cannot see what is happening. The bottom line, we do not have a government here. We have 1% of the people who aren't even Americans. They're globalists. We have 1% of the people that control our media, our money, everything we hear, everything we see, and literally we do not have a government here in this country. As I speak to you, I have emphysema and asthma. The doctors prescribed 6 medications for me. I'm nearly 60. I can only afford 2, the most cheapest ones. I can only afford 2. So if I get this virus that's going around, I'm probably pretty much a goner. But I really don't care, because at this age and living in this country the way it is, I've lost so much hope, and my son has lost so much hope. I mean, literally, if this virus took me away, it'd probably be a blessing. I just don't see how I don't see how they can fix this. How can we fix it when the people hiding in the shadows have these puppets called politicians that make all the policies that put all the money in the pockets of 5 people and starve us. The problem is obvious. It's globalism. It's neoliberalism. We need to bring our industry back home. We need to bring our jobs back home. We need to learn to be self-sufficient and care for others.
God bless you and God preserve you. Thanks, John, in Oregon. Wayne is in Cheshire. Go ahead, Wayne.
I believe this is some important information for your viewers.
Yeah.
I'll say it loud and slow. Tomorrow, Sainsbury's throughout the UK, it's beginning tomorrow. It's on every Monday, every Wednesday and every Friday. All-in times are normally 7 a.m. till 10, but starting tomorrow ongoing are 8 a.m. till 8 p.m. And for the first hour, between 8 and 9, is only for elderly, disabled, NHS workers, vulnerable, social care workers.
Well, Wayne, that is very important information, and I'm sure everyone will take note of that. Let me press on. Tim is in Hertfordshire. Tim, go ahead.
Hi, thanks, George. I'd just like to let people know that the major thing happening with food at the moment is that last week, 50% of the food was eaten outside of the home. Next week, 95% of the food is going to be eaten inside people's homes.
Yeah, good point.
There's a massive change in the distribution.
Yeah.
That's one point. The second thing is we're trying, along with a partner, to get a distillery on the farm to produce this alcohol gel. For 5 days, we've been on to HMRC to take the duty off with no success. We need people in government to just take some action.
This is alcohol duty that on alcohol that would be used for gel.
That's correct, yes.
And what's their answer on that? Or is there no answer?
We can't get any answer for 5 days. We've been trying, calling, emailing HMRC just to get reassurance that it won't have duty on it.
Mm. And you're producing this, are you, Tim?
A friend of mine's got a distillery based on the farm here.
Yeah.
This week we've gone from delivering 100 food boxes to 400 in 1 week.
Wow.
There is issues with getting food in from wholesalers in Europe right now. There should be enough food in the country, but the distribution networks need to change completely.
Yeah, totally. I mean, the point you made right at the beginning of your contribution is true. I mean, I'm a case in point. I eat at least half of my meals outside of the home. Now I'm going to eat almost every one of them inside the home, and that'll be true for a very large number of people. So the distribution of food is now very different. I need to go to shops to buy my food, whereas I would once have eaten it in a fish and chip shop. Tim, thanks for that. Julian is in East Sussex. Let's hear from him. Julian?
Hi, George.
Yeah.
Sorry. I'm from Lewis, not Lewes. Anyway, again, just interested in the supermarkets wanting to employ further people. And I'm interested to know whether they're going to get a good contract or whether it's just going to be an extension of the gig economy just for the while.
I don't know the answer to it. I mean, I sing hallelujah that 30,000 people are going to get a job that didn't have one before. The next task is to make sure it's a proper job. The supermarkets are undoubtedly now making utterly gigantic profits. Their alcohol sales must be up because pubs are closed. Their food sales are up because cafes and restaurants are closed. Their food sales are up because huge queues of people are panic buying. And they need to put at least some of that back into the pay packets of the people who actually do the work. Mr. Sainsbury is not often found on the vegetable aisle. Julian, thanks for that important question. Just while I'm waiting for the rest of these calls, here's Ben Kavanagh from Edinburgh. Boris Johnson's herd immunity is an absolute disaster. And while the Scottish nationalists couldn't take massive fiscal action on their own, They could have taken strong measures to contain the virus in Scotland. They could have stopped flights in, instituted rigid quarantine and social distance measures. Why didn't they? Is it just the issue of the English border? What do you think? Thanks for the great show, says Ben. Well, I think Scottish nationalism is defunct for the time being, as our guest earlier said. Regards, Martin. What's your view on the Coylham Bridge hotel sackings? Was it an administrative error, as stated by the hotel group, or was it a modern-day clearance, in that not only did they lose their jobs, they lost their accommodation as well? This is part of the Britannia Hotels group. It's not the only place where they committed this crime against their workforce, and it will always be remembered, I think, by the public when this is over, if indeed it ever is. Ian in Colchester says there should be a new basic tax rate that is applied to all NHS staff, which doubles the current tax-free allowance. This would give the staff more money in their pockets, with those on low salaries benefiting most. Can also be done without directly finding any additional NHS budget. And that's from Ian in Colchester. This from David Howard. Angela Merkel had just had a pneumonia vaccine when 2 days later her doctor tested positive for coronavirus. Question raised. Obviously, Angela Merkel was aware there was the benefit of having a pneumonia vaccine in the event that she contracted the coronavirus, raising the question as to why all our vulnerable people haven't similarly been vaccinated. Teresa says, free movement without the infrastructure and investment to support it, just crazy. Chickens are coming home to roost. And Mad Planet says basically people are helping the herd immunity initiative, but are too stupid to realise, unfortunately. The worst time is to be out now. A lot of people are infected without knowing. It's utter madness. And Keith says, I doubt there are any national healthcare providers that would cope with COVID-19 from a standing start. And Ben Noyes says, nationalise all private hospitals now and make the beds available to the NHS. Moeen Qureshi says, my daughter left back for London a couple of days back. She was shocked that there was no screening of passengers arriving. We, a third world country, Pakistan, is performing such screening at the airports. I learned from Neil Clark on Twitter earlier this evening that actually flights are still coming into London from all of the worst affected areas in the world. I just don't understand that. I don't understand Boris Johnson's louche, leisurely, lazy approach to all of this. If it's going to end up, as I'm certain that it is, in Chinese, Korean levels of lockdown and decisive state action, why not do it earlier than this? Why wait till it's too late every time? You closed the pubs too late and gave them a day's notice so they could all give it to each other on the final night. You're now closing the other public spaces. Too late. Too little, too late. You're doing nothing about panic buying, nothing about hoarding, nothing about profiteering. Eventually you will have to, or rioting will break out in this country. So why not do it now? That's my point. Clear the decks. There's a legend on the line. It's Norma in Bristol. Go ahead, Norma.
Hello, George. Just my 2 pence. I thought you'd like to know that we're okay, and we've got lots of friends and family helping us to stay in our home. But, you know, others have an awful lot of added stress. You know, some of these families, they're all at home now. They're having to occupy their children. They've got small places with very little money. It is a very serious problem, this moment.
Very serious.
And the other point was, I thought I'd just mention for once, my youngest granddaughter, she's a trainee nurse, 2nd year, and she's working very hard in the intensive care unit in Bristol. And she's a lovely girl, and she's getting on with it very well at the moment, but who knows what's going to happen,
God bless her. What's her name, Norma?
Connie.
Big shout out to her.
Yeah, and George, on a lighter note, are you missing the sport? Because I am watching sport.
Desperate. I'm utterly bereft at the... I don't watch sport. I only watch football. That's the only sport. But I do watch it every night. And I play it with my sons. Indoors or in the garden or in the park when we could. And I talk to my children by text. My older boy is sending me texts even right now as I'm on air about football, about Manchester United, who are they going to buy and so on. I'm absolutely devastated by the loss of the football, even though, of course, it pales into insignificance compared to the suffering and death that's being caused elsewhere. But it's special punishment, George, for me, Norma. Who do you support yourself?
Bristol City, how do you think?
Bristol City, there you go. Great cup run they had a couple of years ago. Norma, thank you, my darling, for that great call. I've got Christopher from Hong Kong on the line, and I simply must fit him in. Christopher, how's it going in China?
It's looking good, sir. I'm alive where I'm living, which is on the, Hong Kong SAR, but specifically on a very small island. We have 0 infections, I'm pleased to report. We have just over 300 infections since January 23rd, now existing in the territory. 50%, I'm afraid to say, that's a 50% increase in infections in 1 week. The majority of said infections have been imported. That is, we have people flying in who are infected. So we have stricter control measures have been implemented since Friday to curtail that. Briefly, and for the general public globally, please listen to medical advice not to congregate. We've had clusters of infections in Hong Kong with those below 30 years of age because they have congregated in pubs and restaurants, that is, hot zones where young people go to, the rich go to enjoy themselves after work, and gyms. We're talking middle-class people infecting themselves and disobeying detailed information that the state has given to them. It's heartbreaking.
Hallelujah. That is very good advice. And take care, Christopher. It's lovely to hear from you again in Hong Kong. I'm sorry that the hour was so late. Almond Tree says, you spoke about how highly you hold the World Health Organization and doctors. Today, on WHO Twitter, they advised against using masks. I didn't see that advice. And they posted about washing hands. How come WHO and the NHS are still not telling people that it lives in the air for 3 to 4 hours, transmitted via breath, even by asymptomatic carriers? That's exactly why masks are useful. They're not, of course, foolproof, especially not a cheap little mask like this one, but they're better than nothing. And Dave in South Wales says, for the sake of humanity, Bernie must stay in the race. He's the only leader seriously capable of dealing with the US coronavirus. We have never needed a more capable politician in a generation in the world's most powerful country. That's Dave in South Wales, making the point that all of us are interested in what happens everywhere. The President of the United States will not be our president, but the actions that they take and don't take will affect all of us, our lives and our futures. It's been marvelous for me. I hope it was for you. We've had a super big audience tonight. We'll continue the show as long as we are physically able to do so. So far, so good. We'll be back at the same time in the same place next week. And I'm asking you to bring somebody else with you. Our audience last week was well over 500,000. It needs to be 1 million plus. It needs to be people, thinking people, people who question more all over the world. Thanks very much for watching and listening.